Beneath Michigan's forests, under its lakes, and carved into its cliffs, lie secrets older than pyramids, older than written history itself, forgotten hunting traps beneath Lake Huron. Copper mines worked before Rome rose, carvings in stone no one can read. For thousands of years, people walked here, built here, and vanished, leaving behind mysteries we still can't explain. Tonight, we're diving into 33 prehistoric enigmas of Michigan, a journey through deep time, lost landscapes, and questions that refuse to die. This isn't just history. It's the ghost map of a world buried beneath our feet. Before we dive in, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss a journey into the strangest corners of history. And while you're here, drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. Let's see just how far and how many hours apart this mystery travels. 9,000. Year-old caribou drive lanes, under Lake Huron, the Drop 45 complex. Beneath the cold, dark waters of Lake Huron, buried under centuries of sediment, drowned by glacial melt, and sealed away from casual discovery, lies a frozen moment in deep time, a highway. Or rather, a hunting highway, laid down by human hands nearly 9,000 years ago. It's called the Drop 45 Drive Lane Complex, and it's not just old, it's older than cities. Older than writing, older than metal tools. It is one of the most intact prehistoric hunting landscapes ever found beneath the Great Lakes, and we barely understand who built it, let alone how. Drop 45 isn't a single structure. It's a web of linear stone arrangements, lanes, blinds, and guidance features all methodically constructed atop what was once dry land. Back then, Lake Huron wasn't the oceanic basin we see today. It was still filling, and between modern-day Michigan and Ontario ran a ridge, the Alpena-Amberley Ridge, exposed like a stony spine. That ridge served as a natural corridor, a kind of Pleistocene expressway for migrating caribou, and humans, being what they are, ingenious, opportunistic, and always watching, turned it into a trap. Now imagine this. Thousands of stones carefully placed in straight or gently curving lines, forming channels across a barren ridge. These weren't random piles or glacial leftovers. They were tools. Caribou herds, moving with seasonal precision, would follow the land's contours. The drive lanes would gently funnel them like sheep into a pen toward kill zones, where hunters waited in blinds hidden behind more stone. The caribou wouldn't see them until it was far too late. And this happened underwater. Today, these structures sit 120 feet beneath the surface of Lake Huron. But radiocarbon dating, sediment analysis, and sonar mapping have revealed their secret. They were built during the Lake Stanley low stand, when water levels dropped drastically due to retreating glaciers. What we see today is an ancient hunting system frozen in time, so well preserved that archaeologists have found wooden tools, stone projectiles, even organic remains. But here's the kicker. We don't know how many of these lanes exist. The Drop 45 complex is only one of several mapped so far, and many more likely remain buried or undiscovered along the Submerged Ridge. It's a needle in a haystack situation, with the haystack being 1,000 square miles of lake bed. And beyond the raw engineering, the coordination it took is baffling. This wasn't the work of one person, or even a small band. It hints at a broader social organization, a shared strategy spanning generations. Who were these people? Archaic-era hunter-gatherers, yes, but that's like calling Da Vinci a painter. The builders of Drop 45 knew the land and animals intimately. They mapped terrain without GPS, timed migrations without calendars, and moved literal tons of stone without metal tools. They likely had oral traditions, seasonal camps, communal planning rituals, but no writing, no monuments, just this stone legacy, preserved by water and time. And then there's the mystery of scale. Were these lanes used for centuries or for a brief pulse of years? Did multiple bands cooperate here, or was this the domain of a single group guarding sacred territory? And what of the deeper logistics? How did they process the meat, transport it, store it, survive winter? Drop 45 raises more questions than it answers. Some scientists compare it to caribou drives still used by indigenous groups in the Arctic, like the Inuit, who use snow berms and natural features to shape herd movement. But those modern analogs have living memory and ethnographic context. Drop 45 has neither. It is a ghost of a world long gone, rediscovered only by remote sensing and deep water diving. And every time we uncover a new blind or lane, the picture gets more complex. Here's the strange irony. We may know more about what happened here 9,000 years ago than we do about what lies just a mile away, because this ridge is only the beginning. Drop 45 is part of a much broader network of underwater stone structures along the Alpena-Amberley Ridge. They stretch for miles, weaving a silent web across the ancient lakebed. And while Drop 45 has been studied intensely, the rest? The rest is mostly unmapped, unexplored, undisturbed. Which leads us to the next mystery, one that could make Drop 45 look like the tip of a megalithic iceberg. Because as it turns out, the Alpena-Amberley Ridge isn't just home to one ancient caribou highway. It might be home to dozens of other stone, wood hunting structures along the Alpena-Amberley Ridge. If Drop 45 is a page torn from a prehistoric playbook, then the rest of the Alpena-Amberley Ridge might be the entire volume scattered, waterlogged, and waiting to be read. Stretching roughly 160 kilometers across what is now the bottom of Lake Huron, the Alpena-Amberley Ridge was once a dry, windswept land bridge connecting the lower and upper Great Lakes. A strategic corridor, like the narrowest part of an hourglass, compressing migrations, channeling movement, and inviting human ingenuity. What has been uncovered so far tells us this ridge wasn't just used, it was engineered. And here's the unsettling part. Drop 45 is just one of many. Archaeologists working with sonar, underwater ROVs, and side-scan imaging have discovered dozens of similar structures dotting the submerged landscape. Some are stone alignments, like those at Drop 45, carefully laid lanes and crescents, forming invisible chutes in the open terrain. Others include upright wooden stakes, root balls driven into the lakebed. Wood, underwater, preserved for 9,000 years. It's like finding ghost architecture, a blueprint in timber and stone of how people once reshaped their world. And they didn't just build at random. These weren't crude, opportunistic kills. The design was meticulous. The scale, astonishing. Some drive lanes run for hundreds of meters. Some converge at natural pinch points. Others loop or zigzag, indicating strategic herding based on terrain. Picture an invisible maze stretching across a tundra, guiding herds into ambush points with the precision of a military campaign. These were not passive structures. They were active tools, used, modified, reused. But we don't know how many structures there truly are. The lake covers most of the ridge now. That means mapping it is like assembling a jigsaw puzzle in a dark room with mittens on. Every sonar pass reveals something new. A pile of stones in suspiciously straight formation, a line that doesn't match glacial patterns, or a cluster of anomalous readings. Is it human-made? Natural? Both? Until we dive, sample, and date, we don't know. But the pattern is emerging, and it's clear. Drop 45 wasn't a one-off. It was part of a larger system, one that could rewrite how we understand early North American hunting societies. And here's where it gets weirder. The ridge wasn't just a drive site, it was also a seasonal landscape. Evidence suggests people didn't just pop in for a hunt and bounce. They stayed. Campsites have been located near some of the structures. Charcoal layers, tool debris, broken points, signs of habitation. That suggests a level of planning far beyond simple subsistence. People were organizing labor, sharing knowledge, and probably passing these sites down through generations. A kind of hunting lease handed down not with deeds, but with stories. The logistics are mind-bending. Coordinating a drive like this would have required scouts, spotters, drivers, and killers. Everyone knew their role. Everyone had to act in sync. And because caribou migration is predictable but fast, you only get a few days, maybe hours, when conditions are perfect. One misstep and the herd's gone. All that stonework, useless until next season. But again, who were these people? We still don't have a name. No tribe, no recorded language, just a cultural shadow, glimpsed through artifacts and architecture. Some scholars link them loosely to early archaic traditions in the Great Lakes region. But the truth is, they might have been their own thing entirely. An independent cultural lineage that left no mounds, no petroglyphs, no standing monuments. Only their knowledge, etched in the placement of stones and stakes, now submerged. And speaking of submerged, preservation here is unprecedented. The lake, ironically, saved everything. Without it, these wooden stakes would have rotted. The stone lanes would have been trampled or buried. But the cold, low-oxygen waters of Huron sealed it all like a time capsule. In some cases, wooden posts still stand upright. That kind of organic preservation is nearly unheard of for sites this old in North America. It gives us a glimpse not just of tools or bones, but of landscapes, entire ecologies, frozen in place. So what does it all mean? It means that the Great Lakes weren't a blank space in prehistory. They weren't a wilderness waiting to be discovered. They were a highway, a hunting ground, a homeland. And the people who lived here weren't stumbling through the Ice Age. They were thriving, adapting, innovating, leaving behind one of the most intact large-scale hunting systems on the continent buried just out of sight. But what happened when the waters rose? That's the question that haunts every sonar scan. These people had built a life on land that was vanishing. The glaciers melted. Lake Stanley became Lake Huron. Shorelines crept higher. Camps drowned. Drive lanes disappeared. And yet, the ridge still whispers through the silt, telling us something was lost here, something vast. Which leads us to the next enigma, the lake itself. Because before it swallowed these hunting grounds, it gave something just as strange. A land bridge, a shelf, a vanished corridor across the heart of Huron, where people didn't just hunt, they lived. The Lake Stanley Lowstand land bridge across Huron. Before the Great Lakes became Great Lakes, before they drowned the world of stone drive lanes, wooden stakes, and ancient campsites, there was a shelf. A vast, dry, open plain spanning the basin of what we now call Lake Huron. It wasn't a myth. It wasn't an anomaly. It was a genuine land bridge, a flat corridor carved by glaciers, exposed during the Lake Stanley Lowstand, roughly 10,000 to 7,500 years ago. And people didn't just pass through it. They moved, hunted, camped, cooked, exchanged, and maybe even settled across that drowned backbone. The land bridge wasn't merely a route, it was a landscape. A vanished stage of human history, temporarily unveiled by Ice Age physics and now locked beneath over 100 feet of water. Today, it's one of the most poorly understood pieces of Michigan's prehistoric puzzle, and one of the most tantalizing. First, let's clarify what the Lake Stanley Lowstand even was. Around 9,000 years ago, the glaciers that had smothered the Great Lakes region were retreating. As they melted, complex systems of meltwater channels, isostatic rebound, and drainage changes caused the levels of Proto-Huron to drop dramatically. For a period, a wide swath of land emerged between what is now the northeastern lower peninsula of Michigan and southern Ontario. This land, flat, cold, and likely covered in tundra and boreal forest, was the Alpena-Amberley Ridge. But during this low stand, it didn't just rise, it connected. Imagine a land bridge nearly as wide as a small country, lying across the middle of what we now call Lake Huron. Not just a narrow crossing like the Bering Land Bridge or the English Channel during its low stand, but a broad, dry, habitable landscape. Caribou roamed it. So did wolves. So did people. It was a corridor of life long before the water swallowed it. What kind of life? That's where things get murky, quite literally. The problem is, most of what we know or suspect about human activity on the land bridge comes from small clues scattered across the submerged floor. Stone tools, fire pits, butchery sites, seasonal camps, drive lanes like Drop 45. These discoveries suggest that people not only passed through, they adapted to the land bridge in highly organized ways. There's even evidence of semi-permanent use, repeated occupations, possibly over generations. But we can't dig easily. Everything is underwater. That means any real archaeology requires expensive, high-tech operations divers, submersibles, sonar, sediment cores. It's like trying to excavate the bottom of the ocean with a teaspoon. And yet, each time we look, the pattern deepens. So what did life look like on the land bridge? Picture early Holocene humans waking with the dawn in leather-covered shelters, emerging to watch the mist rise off the shallow, glacial ponds dotting the plain. Children tracking caribou prints near streams. Elders maintaining tool caches, piles of flint, antler, and bone. Groups dispersing in spring, then reuniting in fall. This wasn't the edge of the world. It was their world. And not just for hunting. The land bridge could have served as a migration route, a trade corridor, a shared cultural zone. Early peoples may have used it to connect inland groups from southern Michigan with others in Ontario or the Upper Peninsula. The lack of physical barriers, the flatness, the openness meant communication and travel would have been surprisingly fluid. Ideas moved, so did goods. Copper from Isle Royale, chert from Bayport. The land bridge was the artery that pumped through it all. But then, the waters returned. As post-glacial rebound altered the drainage basins and the Atlantic Ocean continued to rise, the Great Lakes filled. Slowly, then faster. The bridge began to drown. Camps were abandoned. Drive lanes fell silent. Fires went cold. Bit by bit, the lake reclaimed the corridor. What did people do? We don't know. Did they retreat inland, abandoning the lake's center? Or did they adapt, becoming shoreline dwellers, canoe makers, fishers on the new edge of a freshwater sea? It's one of the central mysteries of this region. How did the cultures of the land bridge transform as their landscape vanished beneath them? Some argue the land bridge was never settled permanently, that it was too harsh, too exposed. But the structures we've found tell a different story. Complex hunting systems, spatial planning, seasonally occupied camps. There was intent here. The land wasn't just used, it was understood. And it still holds secrets. If the land bridge was as central as we believe, it may still be hiding entire village sites, burial zones, sacred spaces lost under centuries of silt and ice-cold fresh water. Some of those may be preserved in ways unimaginable on dry land. Organic materials, basketry, even ancient footprints frozen in clay. We just haven't found them yet. And what if we do? What if the heart of Michigan's prehistory lies not in its forests or mounds, but 100 feet underwater? What if our image of the past nomadic bands chasing game isn't just incomplete, but dead wrong? Because if this land bridge was a home, not a hallway, then we have to rethink everything. But before we go deeper, we need to talk about a strange new controversy, something that seems out of place among the clean lines of underwater archaeology. Because at the edge of the bridge, near the modern-day Straits of Mackinac, sonar picked up something that doesn't look natural. It looks rectilinear. Straits of Mackinac sonar, rectilinear patterns, near line 5. Beneath the churning surface of the Straits of Mackinac, where Lake Michigan and Lake Huron meet in a furious, eternal swirl, something strange rests on the floor. Sonar scans have picked up shapes. Not smooth, rolling undulations like those carved by glacial drift. Not jagged, chaotic heaps of broken stone, but lines. Clean, angled, organized, rectilinear patterns. In plain English, these things look like they were made by someone. This is where the archaeological mystery veers into something stranger, something halfway between science and speculation, where geologists, archaeologists, and underwater engineers eye each other across a table and say, "You seeing this too?" The area in question lies disturbingly close to the Enbridge Line 5 oil pipeline, a 645-mile steel artery running through the Straits. In the process of monitoring that infrastructure, sonar scans lit up a section of the lakebed with a layout that looked almost architectural. We're talking long, parallel lines, right angles, geometric formations, enough to raise eyebrows, enough to start an argument. Are these formations just bizarrely regular geological features? Or are they remnants of something much older and much more deliberate? Let's be clear. Nature is full of surprises. Ice and water can carve straight lines, sometimes with shocking precision. Erosion can produce angular patterns. Glacial movements can leave behind striated surfaces. So yes, there are natural processes that can mimic the artificial. But that's not the issue here. The issue is that these lines don't quite behave like natural formations. They intersect in unnatural ways. Some form closed shapes. Some seem to align with one another across long distances. And their placement right along a former paleo shoreline raises even more suspicion. Why would a formation like this exist in the Straits? And what might it have been? Some researchers believe we could be looking at the foundation remnants of a structure or enclosure, maybe a hunting platform, a fish weir, or even something ceremonial. The area, after all, would have been dry land during parts of the Lake Stanley lowstand. If humans were using the Alpena-Amberley Ridge as a migration corridor, then the Straits could have been a choke point, a narrow land passage where people gathered, hunted, maybe even built. Others are more skeptical. They argue we're chasing shadows, reading intention into random formations. After all, pareidolia is a powerful thing. The human brain is hardwired to find patterns, especially ones that resemble familiar shapes like squares, walls, or roads. And when you're staring at grainy sonar images from 1,000 feet below, it's easy to start drawing conclusions that the data doesn't support. But here's where things get messier. If this were the only rectilinear anomaly in the Great Lakes, it might be dismissed, but it's not. Similar patterns have been detected in other submerged areas around the region, along ancient shorelines, drowned terraces, and former ridges. Some of these features have been studied and dismissed as glacial or fluvial in origin. Others remain unexplained, but the one in the Straits? It's the most politically charged, the most visible, and the most potentially explosive. Why? Because if these are artificial structures, they predate nearly everything else in Michigan's built history. We're talking about the possibility of 9,000-year-old architecture underwater. That would push back our understanding of prehistoric engineering in the region by thousands of years. And it would suggest that early peoples here didn't just build drive lanes and campsites. They built structures, possibly permanent ones. Of course, there's a wall of complications. The sonar data isn't perfect. The visibility in the Straits is terrible silt. Currents and temperature changes make diving incredibly difficult. And with the pipeline sitting right there, access is politically sensitive and heavily restricted. It's not exactly an open invitation for academic exploration. So, until someone gets down there with high-definition imaging, ground truths, the shapes, and takes some sediment cores, all we have are questions. But the implications are huge. If these formations are artificial, they open up a new dimension of prehistoric life in the region. They suggest organized labor, engineering knowledge, a worldview where people weren't just living on the land, they were shaping it, building into it, possibly even memorializing it. Maybe this wasn't just a site of survival. Maybe it was sacred. Or maybe not. Maybe we're looking at nothing. just weird geology, teased into mystery by wishful thinking and fuzzy imaging. That's the burden of underwater archaeology. It's expensive, slow, and maddeningly ambiguous. Every answer drowns in 10 more questions. But one thing's clear. The Straits were important. Not just geologically, but culturally. They sit at the literal crossroads of two Great Lakes. That makes them a natural convergence point, not just for water, but for people. And just a few miles away, buried in that same convergence zone, there's something even older. It's not shaped like a structure. It's shaped like a forest. A forest that never should have survived. But it did. A submerged spruce forest in the Straits dated 10,711,750 years ago. In the deep heart of the Straits of Mackinac, where fresh water churns with unpredictable fury, lies a site that should not exist. A forest, not a fossilized one, not petrified, but preserved, its trees still standing, roots still gripping ancient soil, trunks upright beneath 100 feet of water. This is the submerged spruce forest of the Straits, radiocarbon dated to somewhere between 10,700 and 11,750 years ago. It's not just a fluke of preservation. It's a ghost ecosystem, one that challenges our understanding of the region's post-glacial transformation and offers an eerie glimpse into a Michigan most people can't even imagine. Back then, the Great Lakes were infants. The glaciers had pulled back but still loomed on the horizon like frozen gods. Meltwater flooded lowlands. Ice-blocked rivers rerouted entire drainage basins. And in the brief geological blink between cataclysm and inundation, life crept back in. That's when the forest grew. This wasn't a vast redwood grove or a dense tropical canopy. It was more modest, mostly black spruce, short-needled, hardy, slow-growing. A forest suited for a post-apocalyptic tundra landscape. The kind of trees that whisper instead of roar. But here's the thing. They didn't just grow. They thrived. The soil they stood in was rich, with decomposing organic matter signs of a stable ecosystem. And they lasted long enough to become rooted, mature, and eventually entombed by rising water. The idea of a living forest being flooded and preserved without rotting sounds like fantasy, but the conditions in the Straits were freakishly perfect. As lake levels rose, cold, oxygen-poor water rapidly covered the land. Bacteria slowed, decomposition halted. The trees were effectively frozen in time. Some are still vertical, locked in place for over 10 millennia, like sentinels from another world. And then we found them. Their discovery didn't come from some grand expedition. It was stumbled upon part accident, part curiosity. Side-scan sonar picked up vertical anomalies on the lake bed. Divers, expecting rock formations or perhaps timber debris from shipwrecks, instead found trunks. Bark still intact in places, rings still readable, roots embedded in a soil horizon long buried under muck. For archaeologists and paleoecologists, this was jackpot-level stuff. Spruce doesn't usually get this kind of afterlife. In most forests, fallen wood rots, collapses, disappears. But here, the trees were time-stamped. The rings held climate data. The soil beneath them retained pollen. Each piece of that submerged forest became a core sample of the past. And here's where it gets even stranger. The age of this forest places it squarely in a transitional moment. The tail end of the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to glacial cold after a warming period. For centuries, temperatures plummeted. Environments were reshaped, species adapted or died. But right as the world began warming again rapidly, chaotically, this forest took root. And as the world warmed, the lakes swelled. What this forest shows us isn't just a timeline. It's a lifestyle. Humans were here. Maybe not right in the Straits at that exact moment, but close enough. The timing overlaps with the very first known inhabitants of the region. Paleoindians, armed with fluted points and ancient knowledge, were spreading across the Great Lakes basin, tracking herds and navigating a shifting, watery frontier. That forest? It may have been a landmark, a gathering place, a natural resource, trees for fuel, saplings for tools, bark for shelter. Or maybe it was something more symbolic, a fixed point in a land that refused to stay still, when everything is melting, moving, drowning. But a standing forest is a promise. But then it vanished. Not burned, not logged, drowned. Slowly at first, as the lake swelled in pulses. The lowest roots were the first to submerge, then the understory, then the trunks. One ring at a time, the forest slipped beneath the waves, sealed away like Atlantis under glacial runoff. And then, for over 10,000 years, nothing. Until now, what do we do with a discovery like this? In one sense, it's a scientific gift. It tells us about ancient climates, lake-level histories, and ecological succession. But in another sense, it's a human story. Because standing beside those trunks, even if only in imagination, is like time travel. You are standing on what used to be land. You are breathing the air your ancestors might have breathed. And you are staring at a drowned forest that remembers more than any scroll or stone tablet ever could. But this forest isn't just a relic. It's a warning. The world changes. Water rises. Land vanishes. What we take for granted, what we think of as permanent, can disappear in the span of a generation. And that's the real haunting part, because nearby, just across Grand Traverse Bay, lies something even stranger. It's not a forest. It's not a structure. It's a single rock, etched with what might be the image of a mastodon. Or maybe nothing at all. Grand Traverse Bay's reported underwater stone lines and the disputed mastodon carving. It begins with a rock, or at least something that looks like a rock. Under 40 feet of water in Grand Traverse Bay, near the center of Michigan's Mitten, a cluster of stones sits silently on the lake bed. To the untrained eye, it looks like a mess, a scattering of boulders deposited by retreating glaciers. But to the trained eye, something's off. The stones are arranged, lined up, aligned in ways that nature usually avoids. Then comes the shock. On one of those stones, etched faintly but unmistakably, is a shape, a carving, the outline of what some claim is a mastodon. And that's when the arguments begin. Is it art? Is it coincidence? Is it something in between? The so-called mastodon carving has hovered at the edge of legitimacy for years. It's never been fully verified, never been universally accepted as authentic, but it refuses to disappear. The image, a bulky body, 4 legs, and what appears to be a tusk or trunk is there, faintly scratched into stone, that now lies beneath Lake Michigan's cool blue surface. To some, it's a hoax or pareidolia, the human brain trying too hard to find familiar shapes in chaos. But to others, it might be one of the oldest examples of rock art in North America. Let's rewind. When the carving was first reported, it wasn't found by treasure hunters or amateur divers. It was part of a serious underwater archaeological investigation, using side-scan sonar to look for shipwrecks and geological features. What came back wasn't a ship. It was a stone formation, linear, organized, clearly not random. Further diving revealed the image, lightly incised on one of the boulders near the formation's center. The pattern of stones nearby is just as strange. They form a line, or what might once have been a hunting lane similar to those at Drop 45, but this line is different. It's curved, almost serpentine, and it stretches across a flat section of lake bed that would have been dry land during the Lake Stanley low stand. Like the Alpena-Amberley Ridge, this part of the bay would have been open, grassy terrain, a likely migration path for caribou or mastodon, the perfect place for a kill zone or a ceremonial site. So, what are we really looking at? Possibility 1. This is a glacial erratic field, and the carving is a coincidence, maybe even modern. Stone alignment is common in nature, and underwater shadows can play tricks on sonar. The carving? Just scratches, maybe made by ice. Or maybe someone, sometime in the last few decades, carved it themselves as a prank. End of story. Possibility 2. This is a legitimate prehistoric site. The stone alignment is a deliberate structure built by Paleoindian or early archaic hunters. The carving is symbolic, a form of proto-art, maybe a representation of the very creature being hunted here. If so, this changes everything. It would be among the oldest known examples of rock art in the Great Lakes region, and it would suggest a symbolic culture that went far beyond survival. Here's the problem. The evidence is fragmentary. The water is cold, visibility is low, and the carved stone hasn't been removed or independently tested. And as with any underwater find, the bar for proof is sky high. Without corroborating artifacts, tools, bones, fire pits, it's hard to make the case conclusively. And so, the mystery lingers. But let's suppose, just for a moment, that it's real. Then someone, roughly 10,000 years ago, etched the image of a mastodon into a stone and placed it, or found it, at the heart of a ceremonial or functional site. This wasn't idle doodling. This was memory, myth, identity. A hunter honoring the beast that fed them. A shaman invoking the spirit of the animal. A culture crystallizing its worldview in the language of rock. Even if it's not a mastodon, let's say it's just an abstract symbol, it still tells us something. It means that people were using this landscape not just as a resource, but as a canvas. They saw meaning in stone. They communicated through shape and placement. And that aligns with what we're seeing across the drowned Great Lakes Basin, that the earliest inhabitants weren't mindless nomads. They were builders, artists, thinkers, and maybe even storytellers. Because the power of this mystery doesn't lie in the carving alone. It lies in what surrounds it. The context, the alignment of stones, the placement along a former shoreline, the hints of a larger, submerged world waiting to be pieced back together. Every sonar pass, every dive, every murky photo of etched rock chips away at the silence of the deep. And just when we think we've reached the limits of underwater mystery, Michigan throws another curveball. Not on the lake bed this time, but along its craggy northern shore, where an ancient cave, half collapsed and barely accessible, hides strange figures painted in red ochre. One of them looks like a spider. Burnt Bluff, aka Spider Cave, pictographs on Lake Michigan's North Shore. Up where the rocky fingers of Michigan's Upper Peninsula claw into the icy waters of Lake Michigan, there's a stretch of shoreline that feels different. The trees are older. The wind seems to carry more than just the cold. And if you climb the limestone bluffs, if you're patient, and if you know exactly where to look, you'll find a fissure in the rock, a shallow cave. Half open, half hidden. Inside, barely lit by sun and shadow, are figures painted in red ochre, ancient, faded, still here. One of them looks like a spider. This is Burnt Bluff, known to some as Spider Cave. And while it doesn't have the fame of petroglyph panels in the Southwest or the monumental carvings of Europe, it might be one of the oldest sacred art sites in the Midwest. A prehistoric canvas smeared across the limestone face of a bluff, whispering symbols into the void of time. Let's start with what we know. The pictographs at Burnt Bluff were painted with red ochre, a mineral pigment that's been used by humans for tens of thousands of years. It sticks, it stains. It doesn't wash away easily, even after centuries of rain and freeze. What's left at Burnt Bluff is weathered, yes, but still visible, still powerful. The figures are strange. There are lines and shapes that defy easy explanation. Some may represent people, others look like animals. But the star of the show, the figure that gives the cave its name, is the spider. Drawn with long, curved legs and a bulbous center, it's not just a doodle. It's deliberate. Its symmetry is too clean. Its placement is too intentional. The spider wasn't put there by chance. It was a message, or a warning, or a memory. But from who? That's where the trail turns speculative. The exact age of the Burnt Bluff pictographs is still debated. Some researchers date them to the late Archaic period around 3000 to 1000 BCE. Others argue they're younger, maybe linked to Anishinaabe traditions. But there's also the possibility that these images are far older, preserved from an earlier symbolic system that predates known oral histories. The problem is, rock art doesn't come with timestamps. No radiocarbon dating on pigment, no artifacts to provide context, just image, pigment, and stone. So what does the spider mean? In many indigenous cultures, the spider is a symbol of creation, weaving, balance. It's a connector between worlds, between stories, between generations. Among the Anishinaabe, the spider is associated with stories like those of Asibikashi, the spider woman, who helped bring light to the world and protect children through dream catchers. But whether these cave paintings tie directly to those beliefs is unclear. The symbols may predate known mythology, or they may be an early expression of it. Either way, the choice of the bluff, its elevation, visibility, and natural echo suggests a site of significance, a place chosen not for convenience, but for resonance. You don't climb halfway up a cliff to paint a casual picture. You do it to make a statement, a ritual, a mark that will last. And Burnt Bluff has lasted. It's survived centuries of weathering, ice storms, wind shear, and erosion. But not all threats are natural. Over the last century, some parts of the cave have been defaced. Graffiti layered over ancient paint, names carved into limestone like someone trying to compete with the ancestors. It's tragic, but it also reminds us this site is real. It's not in a museum. It doesn't have a gift shop. It's raw, vulnerable, and still part of the land. What remains untouched feels powerful, silent but watchful. The spider isn't just a figure on a wall, it's a witness. It's seen generations pass, it's outlasted languages, and it's not alone. Nearby, other faint figures hint at a larger panel, possibly a whole sequence of images, now lost or waiting to be revealed by careful analysis. And then there's the cave itself. Small, tight, a natural acoustic chamber. Speak inside it, and your voice grows. Whisper, and the walls carry it. Paint a figure here, and it echoes. That makes Burnt Bluff more than an art site. It may have been a storytelling chamber. A ritual space. A cave where symbols were amplified by stone and space and time. The spider, in that context, isn't just a creature. It's the web, the connection between people, land, story, and memory. But if that's what Burnt Bluff represents, then it's only one part of a much larger pattern. Because farther southeast, carved not into bluff, but into bare stone beneath open sky, is the largest known rock art site in Michigan. A flat panel filled with symbols, stories, and riddles so old, even their meanings have started to unravel. It's called Ezibi-Gadek Asin, and it might be the closest thing we have to a prehistoric library. Sanilac petroglyphs. Ezibi-Gadek Asin. In the quiet woods of Michigan's Thumb, far from the drowned drive lanes and half-buried hunting corridors of the Great Lakes Basin, a sandstone outcrop rises from the forest floor like a secret finally breaking the surface. The land around it is calm, trees rustle, birds dart overhead, but the rock? The rock is loud. Welcome to Ezibi-Gadek Asin, the written on stone known more commonly as the Sanilac petroglyphs. This is Michigan's largest known collection of petroglyphs, a flat canvas of ancient carvings etched into soft sandstone by hands long gone and meanings half remembered. It is not an abandoned place. It is a dialogue between generations, between land and people, between what was remembered and what was allowed to fade. At first glance, the rock seems modest. It's not towering or theatrical. It doesn't demand your awe, but step closer, and the surface begins to shift. Lines appear, then shapes, then symbols. Dozens of them. Human figures with arms raised, creatures with tails and horns, abstract patterns that ripple like language without words. Some images seem obvious, others feel encoded. It's a message sent across time, but the translation is uncertain. The petroglyphs were likely carved somewhere between 300 and 1,000 years ago, placing them in the late woodland or early Mississippian periods. But there's a chance, just a chance, that some of the markings are older still, maybe much older. Carvings on sandstone don't survive the way they do on granite or basalt. The softness of the rock means many images have faded or been erased entirely by centuries of weather, fire, and human interference. What remains is a fraction of what once was. But even that fraction is enough to overwhelm. One figure, known by some as the bowman, appears to wield a bow and arrow rare in petroglyph art and symbolically loaded. Is he a hunter, a warrior, a cultural hero? Another figure, human-like but abstracted, seems to have rays or energy lines radiating from its body, possibly a spirit or a deity. There are four-legged animals, some easily identifiable as deer or elk, others more mysterious. And interwoven through all of them are zigzags, spirals, and lines, possible representations of journeys, rivers, thunder, or thought itself. Then there's the water panther, a long-tailed creature with a horned head carved with clear intent. Known in Anishinaabe cosmology as Mishipeshu, the water panther is a powerful being, both protector and punisher. It's a common figure in Great Lakes rock art, and its appearance here links Ezibiagadek Asin to a much wider tradition. The stories behind the symbols stretch across tribes, centuries, and geography. But not all interpretations agree. Scholars, indigenous knowledge keepers, and archaeologists continue to debate the precise meanings of the carvings. Some argue the site was ceremonial, a sacred gathering place where myths were anchored to stone. Others see it as a record, a literal petroglyphic journal chronicling stories, warnings, or territorial claims. Still others suggest it may have been part of a larger landscape of symbols, now erased or hidden. What's certain is that the site has survived against the odds. In 1881, a massive forest fire swept across the Thumb region, stripping the land bare. Trees turned to ash, settlements were wiped out. But when the smoke cleared, the sandstone outcrop was exposed for the first time in generations. Locals noticed the strange markings. The site was discovered in the way that many indigenous places are by people who didn't know what they were looking at. And from that moment on, the site began a new kind of slow erosion. Tourists walked on it. Vandals carved initials. Even well-meaning observers, trying to trace the figures with chalk or crayon rubbings, wore down the fragile etchings. Only in recent decades has serious effort been made to protect the panel. Today, it's enclosed in a pavilion, monitored by researchers and tribal representatives. Still, the sandstone continues to weather. The clock is ticking, but the carvings endure. They do more than hint at spiritual depth, they demonstrate continuity. These are not the isolated expressions of a lost people. They are the visual records of a living worldview. Many Anishinaabe elders still visit the site, not as archaeologists, but as descendants. They see teachings in the images, lessons, warnings. One figure, for example, appears to hold a pipe, possibly referencing peacemaking, ceremony, or the sacredness of speech. Another has been interpreted as a reminder of balance between human and nature, life and spirit, earth and sky. Yet even as some meanings persist, others remain obscure. The carvings do not explain themselves. They resist translation. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Ezibiagadek Asin was never meant to be fully read. Maybe it was meant to be remembered, a place to return to, not for answers, but for grounding. To see the marks in the stone and know that someone, long ago, stood in this very spot, thought these very thoughts, and left a message, not in words, but in shapes, carved by hand and will. But if these petroglyphs are a kind of prehistoric text, then there's another, stranger chapter carved far to the northwest one that didn't just scratch symbols into stone. It carved holes into the earth, hundreds of them, on an island that glittered with metal. Isle Royale, Minong, copper pits by the hundreds. Far out in the blue heart of Lake Superior, closer to Canada than to Michigan's mainland, a narrow, rugged island stretches like a spine through the waves. Windswept, mist-bound, and mostly uninhabited, Isle Royale, called Minong by the Ojibwe, feels remote even now. But if you could strip away the centuries of moss, leaf litter, and rust, you'd see something startling beneath the surface. Pits. Hundreds of them. Not random, not natural. Dug, carved, hollowed out of bedrock with stone tools and fire. These ancient copper pits cover the island like forgotten scars. From the southern shoreline to the interior ridges, they cluster in places where the earth once bled metal. Bright, native copper, pure enough to work without smelting, gleamed in the rock. And people came to get it, not once, not occasionally, but systematically, over and over again. The pits tell us a lot, and they leave even more unsaid. First, consider the scale. These aren't potholes or chance scrapes. Some are several feet deep, others are shallower, but there are so many, well over 1,000 recorded to date, and possibly more hidden by centuries of forest. Each one is the product of labor, of fire setting, heating the rock until it cracked, of hammering, levering, prying copper free, of dragging it to the surface, shaping it, using it, or carrying it away. And this happened thousands of years ago. How long ago? Some copper artifacts associated with Isle Royale mining date back at least 5,000 years, possibly as far back as 7,000 or even 8,000. That means these pits predate the wheel, writing, and the Great Pyramids. When pharaohs were just beginning to dream in limestone, people here were pulling metal from the earth with stone mauls and fire. That alone is staggering, but there's more. Because it wasn't just one or two bands of people digging casually for surface nuggets. The pits suggest organization, specialization, labor coordination. Someone had to find the copper veins. Others had to set fires. Others still had to haul water, hammer tools, and transport the final product. In a pre-agricultural society where food had to be hunted, gathered, or fished daily, that kind of focused effort meant copper wasn't just valuable, it was central. So what were they doing with it? The tools found from this era tell part of the story. Awls, chisels, fishhooks, spears, arrows, sometimes small knives or blades. These were utilitarian objects, yes, but finely crafted. Functional, but elegant. Copper was malleable, durable, and held a sharp edge when cold hammered properly. It didn't require forging, just heat, patience, and knowledge passed down by generations. But the copper didn't stay on Isle Royale. Artifacts made from Minong copper have been found hundreds of miles away, down into the Midwest, through the Ohio Valley, even reaching as far as the Atlantic coast. That tells us the island was more than a mine. It was a hub in a continent-spanning network, a source of prestige material, maybe even a pilgrimage site. Yet the people who mined here left almost no permanent settlements. They came to dig, to work, maybe seasonally, maybe as part of longer journeys. They brought food, tools, and knowledge, but they didn't build cities. They didn't leave behind tombs or temples. What they left, what remains, is the earth itself, hollowed by intent. In some places, the discarded hammerstones litter the surface by the thousands, as if the miners simply dropped their tools when they finished, walked into the forest, and vanished. And here comes the real mystery. Why did it stop? The mining peaked during the Archaic period, but then slowed. The intensity diminished. New methods never emerged. The pits were not replaced by shafts or smelting furnaces. Instead, the island fell silent. Later groups still used copper, but never at the same scale. It was as if the knowledge or the need evaporated. What changed? Did trade networks collapse? Did a spiritual shift redefine the use of metal? Was there a political collapse? A migration? A new taboo? Or perhaps the resources simply ran out, the easily accessible copper gone, and the deeper veins too hard to reach without iron tools? We don't know. And the silence is part of the weight. Because these pits feel haunted, in the archaeological sense, not by ghosts, but by absence. So much effort, so little explanation. And yet, one thing is clear. This wasn't the work of desperate foragers scraping at the earth. This was an industry, one embedded in the landscape, and like all industries, it had its rise, its peak, and its fall. But the question remains, what triggered that rise in the first place? What made the people of Menominee dig so hard, so deep, so relentlessly? Because not long after, geochemical evidence shows something dramatic, an explosive spike in production, a full-scale copper boom that swept through the region like a prehistoric gold rush. And it leaves us staring at the data, wondering, what on earth were they building for? Geochemical evidence places an intense mining pulse, approximately 5,400 BP, what sparked and throttled that production. Somewhere around 6,500 years ago, something shifted. Quietly at first, so quietly, it would have gone unnoticed if not for the chemistry. But once the data came in, the silence cracked. A spike. Not in temperature, not in artifacts, in copper. More specifically, in the chemical fingerprints left behind by prehistoric metalworking. Across the Great Lakes, from mining pits on Isle Royale and the Keweenaw, to artifacts scattered in distant burial sites, we see the same signal, a sudden, massive pulse in copper extraction and circulation. And it's not a small blip on the radar. It's a full-blown prehistoric copper rush. Between roughly 6,500 and 5,400 years before present, about 4,500 to 400 BCE native copper was being removed from the earth and moved across vast distances at an intensity that makes the preceding and following centuries look like a lull. We don't know why. No written records, no inscriptions in stone, just copper artifacts, hammered flat and left in graves, caches, and settlements. And geochemical tracers' ratios of lead isotopes, trace elements, and metallurgical signatures that tie these objects back to their source. And the sources all point to the same places: Isle Royale, Keweenaw, the old mines that now sit silent. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't casual. It was intentional, coordinated, repeated. People weren't just grabbing copper off the surface anymore. They were digging. They were burning. They were grinding bedrock and hauling raw material in bulk, and they weren't doing it for survival. No one needs that much copper to make fish hooks. So what happened? Let's start with the scope. We're talking about thousands of artifacts recovered across the entire eastern half of North America. Some are tools, projectile points, awls, chisels. Others are ornamental beads, rings, shaped plates. But the sheer volume of copper circulating at this time suggests production on an industrial scale, by prehistoric standards, not factory output, but not cottage crafts either. This was organized labor, and not just organized digging, but organized distribution. Trade networks lit up like a copper web, stretching from the Upper Peninsula to the Mississippi Valley, the Appalachian foothills, the Atlantic coast, even the Gulf of Mexico. How do we know? Because copper from the Great Lakes has a unique geochemical profile, and that profile is showing up everywhere. Which raises the deeper question. What was driving the demand? Function is one theory. Copper tools are more durable than bone or stone, easier to shape, reusable. But copper also dulls quickly, and it's too soft for large-scale construction or warfare. It wouldn't have revolutionized toolkits, not in the way iron or bronze would later. So if it wasn't strictly about practicality, it must have been about symbolism. Power, status, sacredness. Copper is beautiful. It shines. It catches light. It holds form. In a world without metal, it would have looked like captured lightning. It's no coincidence that so many copper artifacts from this period are found in burials. The dead were buried with copper as if it meant something about who they were or what they were worth. So, maybe this wasn't a technological revolution. Maybe it was a spiritual one. Imagine a society where copper isn't just a material, but a message, a currency of prestige, a link to the spirit world, a reflection of solar energy, of life, of ancestral power. Now imagine that idea spreading from one group to another, tribe to tribe, region to region. Suddenly, copper isn't just a tool. It's a necessity, a cultural arms race. But something changed. After nearly 1,000 years of intensifying activity, the pulse faded. By 5,400 BP, the intensity of copper production drops. Fewer artifacts, smaller distributions. The industrial hum of prehistoric mining slows to a whisper. Why? Environmental collapse? Unlikely climate conditions remained relatively stable during this period. Resource exhaustion? Possibly. The richest copper seams may have been tapped out, but there's no evidence of ecological devastation or abandoned mines. Instead, what some scholars suggest is even more complex. Social reorganization. Maybe the networks that had fueled the demand for copper broke down. Maybe cultural values shifted. What once symbolized power now symbolized excess, or taboo, or irrelevance. Technologies rise. Religions evolve. Societies pivot. The tools don't disappear entirely. People still use copper, but in smaller amounts, with less reach. The boom was over. And like every boom, it left behind its bones. Scattered tools, hammered sheets, broken pits, chemical echoes in soil and sediment, the residue of ambition. But the idea of copper, the dream of it, didn't vanish. It just changed forms, because long after the pulse ended, people were still pulling copper from the earth, not just in the Keweenaw, not just on Isle Royale, but in places where the trade was less about production and more about connection. Places where a single piece of copper could travel hundreds of miles, passed from hand to hand, from story to story. And one of the most powerful examples of that exchange isn't in the ground at all. It's in the air, traced by copper artifacts found far beyond Michigan's borders. And the deeper mystery isn't how they got there. It's how far those connections truly reached. Keweenaw copper use is greater than or equal to 8,000 years ago. With artifacts far afield, the true reach of those trade exchange networks is still being mapped. Copper doesn't rust like iron. It doesn't crumble like bone. It holds a kind of quiet defiance, refusing to disappear, refusing to be forgotten. That defiance is part of what makes copper from Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula so haunting. Not because it stayed here, but because it didn't. Artifacts made of Keweenaw copper have been found far from the ridges and cliffs where the metal was mined. They turn up in Ohio, in Illinois, in the Mississippi Valley, on the edges of the Atlantic seaboard. Each one a puzzle piece without the full picture, a flash of prehistoric movement that hints at something much bigger, a network of trade and exchange sprawling across eastern North America. And the deeper we dig, the stranger that network becomes. Let's rewind. Keweenaw copper use goes back at least 8,000 years. That's not just guesswork. That's based on actual copper tools recovered from early archaic contexts, awls, projectile points, fish hooks, chisels found in datable strata, in campsites, along riverbanks. Tools shaped not with forges or molds, but with hammerstones and fire. Simple, yes, but efficient and shockingly durable. The copper came from native deposits, chunks of nearly pure metal embedded in rock. No need for smelting, no need for chemistry. Just pull it from the earth, heat it, shape it, cool it. In a world where most people were still limited to bone and stone, copper was nothing short of magic. But here's the twist. Most of the people using Keweenaw copper weren't from Keweenaw. That's where the mystery begins. We find artifacts hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles away from the source. Places with no native copper, no mines, no fire pits filled with hammerstones. But there the copper is, shaped and sharpened and left behind. Why? Trade is the obvious answer, but not trade in the modern sense. There were no roads, no written contracts, no standardized currencies. This was trade woven through memory and myth, gift exchange, kinship reciprocity, alliance making, maybe even spiritual pilgrimage. Copper didn't move as a product, it moved as a relationship. To trace the reach of these networks is to follow a map made of smoke. Each artifact gives a clue, but not a route. You can tell where it ended up, not always how it got there. No carts, no wheeled transport. This was movement on foot, by canoe, through forest and river, across portages and through war zones. And yet, the copper moved. That tells us something critical. These ancient societies were connected, not isolated bands of foragers living hand to mouth, but nodes in a vast cultural web. People talked, traveled, shared. A tool made on the Keweenaw could end up in a burial mound in Indiana, or a ritual cache in Pennsylvania, or in the toolkit of a fisherman beside the Atlantic. That kind of distribution doesn't happen by accident. It happens by intention. But the artifacts don't all look the same. Some are carefully worked, flattened into delicate crescents, etched with patterns, pierced for suspension. Others are crude chunks of copper barely shaped, left rough, maybe used once and discarded. That variation hints at layers of meaning. Some copper was practical, some ceremonial. Some might have been currency, though not in the coin and wallet sense. Prestige goods, maybe. Indicators of status, or offerings to the dead. And then there's the timeline. Copper use doesn't just appear, flourish, and vanish. It pulses, peaks, and valleys. There are stretches of intense production and wide distribution, like the mining pulse we just explored, and others where copper use slows, even disappears in some regions. Why? Climate? Conflict? Cultural shifts? We don't know. But it suggests the network was not a single, stable system. It was a living organism, growing, withering, reorganizing. And as it did, it left its mark on the landscape, not in monuments, but in residues, trails, fragments, stories passed down, and in the tools themselves still gleaming after millennia, still recognizable, still defiant. So just how far did it go? That's still being mapped. Every new find stretches the borders of our understanding. Every copper bead in a burial mound opens another chapter. And geochemical sourcing matching trace elements from artifacts to known deposits has become the flashlight in the dark. It tells us, yes, this piece came from Keweenaw, and that means someone carried it, passed it, valued it. And all of this prehistoric superhighway of copper happened without cities, without writing, without empires. It was a world in motion, held together by rivers and stories and shared materials. It was invisible until the copper spoke. But the real question isn't how far the copper went. It's where it was shaped, not just mined, but molded into tools, into symbols, into signs of identity. And that leads us to a windswept promontory on the southern shore of Whitefish Bay, a place where the land curls into the water like a clenched fist, where archaeologists have found the copper debris, the hammerstones, and the byproducts of a copper workshop that once rang with labor. A place called Naomi Kong Point. Naomi Kong Point, Whitefish Bay. A major shoreline workshop, its production scale, seasonality, and regional role are not fully resolved. On the far eastern edge of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where Whitefish Bay cradles the southern lip of Lake Superior, a low spit of land juts out into the water, Naomi Kong Point. It doesn't look like much. Windswept. Remote. A finger of forest and sand curving into cold steel blue water. But beneath the moss and pine needles, the earth tells a different story. This wasn't just a lookout. This wasn't just a camp. Naomi Kong Point was a workshop, a copper workshop, and not a small one. For generations, prehistoric peoples gathered here, not only to live or pass through, but to make, to hammer, to shape, to transform raw copper into tools, ornaments, and objects we still struggle to categorize. What remains are the echoes of industry-scattered hammerstones, worked copper fragments, fire-cracked rock, and refuse layers built up over centuries. And yet, the real mystery isn't what they made. It's how much, how often, and for whom. Because Naomi Kong isn't an isolated find. It's part of a broader copper story that stretches from the Keweenaw to the Straits, from ancient quarries to deep-water trade routes. But here, for once, the copper didn't just pass through. It was worked, crafted, transformed on site. Let's talk about scale. Excavations have revealed multiple activity zones, areas where copper was clearly hammered and annealed, likely using open fires and stone tools. These zones are rich in copper debitage, small chips, fragments, flakes, and the waste of production. You don't get that kind of scatter unless you're producing in bulk. This wasn't a single family hammering out a fishhook. This was a team, maybe several, possibly over multiple seasons. The word workshop here doesn't mean a shed in the woods. It means a site of specialized activity, organized labor, knowledge passed down. And then there's the material itself. The copper found at Naomi Kong doesn't just lie in raw chunks. It's been processed, shaped, sometimes twisted, often hammered flat. Some fragments appear to be partially formed tools, awls, projectile points, even small blades left behind, broken during production or discarded as failed attempts. This gives archaeologists a rare gift. A snapshot of the process, not just the final product. But the big question remains, was Naomi Kong a permanent settlement or a seasonal hub? The evidence points to something in between. Stratigraphy and artifact distribution suggest repeated occupations, possibly over centuries. But there's little sign of long-term, year-round habitation. No large dwellings, no deep midden heaps like you'd find in a permanent village. Instead, what we see is rhythm return, reuse, retreat. This was likely a seasonal copper production site, strategically placed on the bay's edge, easily accessible by canoe from both the Keweenaw and the interior riverways. In summer and early fall, when the lake was navigable and food resources were abundant, groups may have converged here to mine, trade, and produce. Then, as winter loomed, they dispersed. That seasonal pulse gives Naomi Kong a strange kind of breath. It lived and slept, like a machine turned on only when the stars, the fish, and the people aligned. And the site's location was no accident. Whitefish Bay isn't just beautiful, it's crucial. It's a gateway between Superior and the interior. Rivers branch inland. Canoe routes extend south. From here, copper could flow in all directions. Naomi Kong wasn't just a workshop. It was a hub, a node in a vast, prehistoric network of movement, exchange, and symbolic economy. But the true reach of Naomi Kong's output? Still unknown. Very few artifacts found across the Midwest can be confidently traced back to this specific site. But the clues are mounting. Tools found elsewhere match those produced here. In form, size, and technique, geochemical analysis could eventually confirm those connections. If it does, it may reveal that Naomi Kong wasn't just another stop along the copper trail. It might have been the place where copper became something else. Not just raw metal, but tools, symbols, trade items, sacred objects. Which brings us to the cultural layer. There's no petroglyph panel at Naomi Kong, no ceremonial mound, but the act of copper working itself may have been deeply ritualized. In many indigenous traditions, copper is more than metal. It's alive. It carries power. Working it is a responsibility, not just a task. And a site like this active for centuries, visited again and again, might have held more than economic significance. It may have been sacred, a place where skill met spirit, where labor was a kind of offering, where every ring of stone on copper echoed through more than just air. And yet, as rich as Naomi Kong is, it still leaves us dangling. Because no matter how much copper was shaped here, no matter how many fragments remain, we're missing a critical piece of the story. Where did it all go? Who received these tools? Who traded for them, valued them, buried them with their dead? The production tells one half of the story. The other half, what was done with the copper once it left, is still scattered across the Great Lakes like breadcrumbs. But before we follow those crumbs further, we have to stop and consider one of the region's most enigmatic copper artifacts. Not a tool, not a bead, a boulder. Massive, moved, fought over. And somehow, still not fully explained. The Great Ontonagon Copper Boulder. Its original cultural context and modern repatriation questions keep the story alive. It was huge, round, roughly 10 feet around, and weighing over 3,700 pounds. A copper boulder, not alloyed, not sculpted, just sitting there. A perfect, gleaming bruise in the wilds of Michigan's western Upper Peninsula before it was hauled away. Before it became a prize, a political pawn, and a museum display, it was just sitting there in the Ontonagon River Valley, gleaming in the sunlight, untouched by machines. Scarred only by time and tools, far older than any we remember. This was the Great Ontonagon Boulder. To most people today, it's a relic, a curiosity from the age when explorers and entrepreneurs were tearing through the American wilderness looking for resources to claim. But the truth is older, stranger, and far less settled than the textbooks let on. The Great Boulder wasn't discovered. It was known. Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region, Ojibwe, among them, knew the boulder. They visited it, they respected it, and the marks on its surface tell a quiet story of human contact long before European boots hit this part of the continent. Hammer marks, ancient ones, blunt tools made from stone, used to chip and shave away bits of the metal, not in haste, not to break it down, but maybe to gather its slivers of copper taken not as ore, but as gifts. Ritual? Utility? Both? We don't know. What we do know is that the boulder was not mined in the traditional sense. It was used, carefully, selectively, possibly ceremonially. And then it was taken. In 1843, a team led by Julius Eldred, a Detroit hardware dealer, retrieved the boulder with great difficulty. It was no easy task. The boulder lay deep in the forest, along the Ontonagon River, in rugged, mosquito-choked terrain. Eldred spent months cutting trails, building rafts, and dragging the copper monster out inch by painful inch. He claimed it as a curiosity, a trophy. But what he didn't count on was that the land it came from and the boulder itself were already claimed by someone else, the U.S. government. And before that, the Ojibwe. The boulder's removal came just as the Treaty of La Pointe was being negotiated between the U.S. and local Anishinaabe nations. That treaty opened vast lands to mining interests. But the boulder, specifically, had cultural significance. Its removal sparked conflict, legal disputes, accusations of theft. Eldred claimed ownership. The government stepped in. Eventually, the boulder was taken to Washington, D.C., where it sat for decades as a display in the Smithsonian Institution. A massive, mute souvenir of the copper frontier. But what was lost in that removal? Plenty. The boulder wasn't just a geological oddity. It was a touchstone, literally and symbolically, a fixed point in the cultural geography of the region. There are stories, passed down through Ojibwe oral tradition, that speak of the copper that grew in the ground and the places where spirits left gifts. In this context, the great Ontonagon boulder may have been more than useful. It may have been sacred, a place to make offerings, to listen, to remember. Today, there's a scar where it once rested, and a debate that hasn't ended. Should it be returned? The question of repatriation has been raised multiple times. Indigenous groups have petitioned for its return not as an economic asset, but as a cultural one, to restore the spiritual landscape, to re-anchor a story that was uprooted. But institutions move slowly. Museums operate on the inertia of bureaucracy, and the boulder, immobile by nature and by history, remains in a holding pattern. But even in a museum case, the Ontonagon boulder speaks. It forces us to confront the difference between artifact and ancestor, between geology and meaning, between the extractive mindset of industrial expansion and the reciprocal logic of indigenous tradition. It is both a physical object and a question mark carved in metal. And its removal? That wasn't just a logistical feat, it was a cultural dislocation, a rupture, one that still echoes through Michigan's copper country. More importantly, the boulder wasn't alone. Across the same region, smaller copper sources were being tapped, some scarred by quarrying, others by careful, minimal extraction. But there's a pattern here. People weren't just after copper to hoard it. They used it, shaped it, and possibly honored it. Which brings us to the next mystery, found not in a river or a museum, but deep beneath the forest canopy of Grand Island. A strange series of pits, dug deliberately. But for what? Not for copper. For something else. Grand Island deep pit features, storage, ceremony, or something else. Function is debated despite extensive survey. Grand Island doesn't jump out at you. It's quiet, forested, the kind of place where weather speaks louder than people. Sitting just offshore from Munising and Lake Superior's southern reach, it's a long, wooded hump of land, easy to overlook, but what's buried beneath the pines and maples tells a very different story. Because somewhere between the chipmunk trails and the moss-covered boulders lie a series of human-made pits, deep, deliberate, and still unexplained. They aren't natural. That's been ruled out. They were excavated by hand, with tools, and with purpose. That much is clear. What's not clear is why. These deep pit features, as archaeologists cautiously call them, don't appear to be quarries. They aren't aligned with any known copper veins, and there's no sign of mining debris like hammerstones or smelting residues. They're also not burial mounds, not in the traditional sense. No human remains, no grave goods, no clear mortuary architecture. And yet, they were dug, carefully, repeatedly. Some are over a meter deep, with straight walls and rounded bases, as if someone knew exactly what they were doing. The first time researchers stumbled upon these features, they thought they might be storage pits. That would make sense. Grand Island was seasonally occupied for thousands of years. Its proximity to rich fisheries, hardwood forests, and game trails made it an ideal spot for summer encampments. Digging pits for food storage like cached meat, roots, or berries was a common practice in many indigenous communities. It kept supplies cool and safe from scavengers. But something felt off. The pits weren't located near obvious campsites. They weren't clustered in ways that matched other food storage traditions. And most suspiciously, they didn't contain the kind of refuse you'd expect. No food scraps, no bone clusters, no broken pottery or shell middens. They were empty or filled with sterile soil layers that didn't tell the usual story of domestic life. Which leads to another possibility: ceremony. Could these pits have been ritual spaces? In many cultures across the globe, earthworks and pits are used not for function, but for meaning. They might be part of purification rites, vision quests, or offerings. They might mark celestial events, seasonal cycles, or be linked to oral histories now lost. And in the dense forests of Grand Island, where the light filters through like a dream and the wind never quite goes still, that possibility feels plausible. But again, no direct evidence. No altars, no carvings, no bone or blood. Just the pits and the haunting absence of a clear purpose. So maybe they were something else entirely. Let's entertain a third theory: signaling. Some have speculated the pits might have served as landmarkers or territorial indicators, places carved into the island's skin to signal ownership, presence, or memory. If Grand Island was a seasonal hub for multiple groups, marking your place, your clan, your right to return could have been vital. And what better way to do it than by reshaping the ground? There's also the idea that these pits were multifunctional, used over generations for different purposes. One generation digs them for storage, the next uses them in ceremony. The next forgets the original meaning, but still knows this is where we gather. Memory in landscapes is fluid. Pits can change meaning the same way words do. What complicates all this is how consistent the pit shapes are. That's what truly puzzles archaeologists. The depth, the angles, the spacing. They were made using knowledge, not just instinct. Whoever dug them had a shared understanding of what the pits were for and how they should look. That suggests teaching, tradition, a cultural blueprint passed from hand to hand. And yet, they didn't leave us the key. There are no accompanying symbols, no associated dwellings, no carved markers or totemic posts. These aren't petroglyph panels or mound complexes with layers of material culture to sift through. They're voids in the earth, and they demand interpretation without giving much back. Grand Island itself offers no easy answers. It has been inhabited on and off for over 10,000 years. People have come here to fish, to hunt, to gather, and clearly to dig. But the deep pits remain singular, unique, unlike anything else in the region. They don't show up on neighboring islands or inland camps. They are a signature without a name, which leaves us standing in the forest, staring into a hole in the ground, wondering what it meant. A storage cache? A ceremonial well? A symbolic wound? We don't know. And sometimes, the not knowing is the point. Because just across the island lies another site, less mysterious in shape but equally puzzling in story. A place where people came and went, layering their lives like sediment, each occupation adding more complexity to the land beneath their feet. And then, suddenly, they stopped. Not once, but more than once. Which brings us to the next question. Not what people built or dug, but why, sometimes, they left. Trout Point, Grand Island. Richly layered occupations with puzzling hiatuses. What drove these shifts? At the southern curve of Grand Island, where the dense canopy gives way to lake-facing bluffs and cold superior wind sharpens every sound, lies a place called Trout Point. The name is unassuming, almost cozy, suggestive of fishing trips, quiet streams, and campfires. But buried beneath the sandy soils and forest stuff is something far older and far more complicated, a a site layered with thousands of years of human activity and just as many unanswered questions. Trout Point is one of the most stratified archaeological sites in Michigan. Multiple cultural layers lie stacked like the pages of a book, each layer representing an occupation people arriving, living, working, and leaving. The layers are distinct. They tell a story of return. A site people came back to, again and again. And then, at certain points, they didn't hiatuses, gaps, long stretches of time where the site goes quiet. No fire pits, no trash middens, no tools, just silence in the soil. And it's those silences, the empty chapters in an otherwise full book, that make Trout Point one of Michigan's most quietly haunting prehistoric mysteries. Let's start with the layers that are there. Archaeologists have uncovered clear evidence of occupations spanning from at least 6,000 years ago all the way up to the late woodland period. These weren't fleeting visits, either. Trout Point was used for hunting, fishing, tool-making, and possibly even ceremonial purposes. Stone tools, copper implements, pottery fragments, and organic remains show up in the record evidence of both archaic and woodland peoples returning to this site across generations. And yet, those returns weren't continuous. In some layers, the signs of occupation are rich and dense. Multiple hearths, clusters of tools, debris fields from food preparation or manufacturing. Then, in the next layer up, nothing. Clean sediment, sterile soil, no artifacts, as if the people simply vanished. And then they come back. What could cause such rhythmic abandonment and reoccupation? The most immediate theory is environmental. Lake Superior isn't a tame neighbor. It shifts. It surges. Water levels have changed dramatically over the last several thousand years. High water events could have submerged or eroded parts of the site, making it uninhabitable or less desirable for certain periods. Climatic shifts, cooler temperatures, droughts, flooding, might have made food gathering unreliable. If your best fishing bay turns cold and lifeless, or the deer trails dry up, you move. But that doesn't explain everything. The site's geography remained ideal across these periods. Even during climatic downturns, Trout Point's location, a blend of forest, bluff, and freshwater access, should have kept it valuable. So why leave? Another theory is cultural. Maybe these hiatuses weren't about the land, but about the people. Social upheaval, migration, the rise of new trade networks, any of these could pull communities away. The return generations later might reflect not recovery, but rediscovery. A younger group returning to an ancestral place, guided by oral memory or spiritual connection. A homecoming of sorts, even if no one had lived there in living memory. Or maybe it was more strategic than sentimental. Trout Point might have served as a seasonal or rotational site in a broader network of camps. Occupation wasn't abandoned, it was cycled. The gaps in the soil don't represent population decline, but shifting priorities. Maybe another nearby site became temporarily more favorable, better fishing, better shelter, or a new alliance that pulled groups elsewhere. Still, the silence feels too pronounced. It isn't just less activity, it's the absence of activity. No signs of reuse, no repurposing of old hearths, no scavenging of old tools. The site feels reset, as if deliberately abandoned. That intentionality suggests something more than pragmatism. It hints at taboo. Was Trout Point ever considered off-limits? In some indigenous traditions, certain places become ritually closed after events like death, illness, or conflict. A site might be avoided for generations, only to be reclaimed once its story has been forgotten or reframed. That possibility raises more questions. Was Trout Point a sacred place? A site of a long-lost conflict? Did something happen there that turned memory into avoidance? We may never know. But what we do know is that when people returned, they brought with them new tools, new techniques, new materials. The reoccupation layers at Trout Point show technological evolution, shifted lithic styles, changes in food preparation, even possible new social structures inferred from spatial organization. In other words, the people who left weren't the same as the people who came back. And that's what makes Trout Point so compelling. It isn't just a static site, it's a storyline. A place that charts not only habitation, but transformation. Something caused people to walk away. Something brought them back, and with each return, the land absorbed another version of them. The soil doesn't lie. It holds memories longer than we do. But just as puzzling as these interruptions in use are the forms of use themselves. Because not far from Grand Island, across Michigan's Lower Peninsula, there are places where the earth itself has been shaped, not just dug or occupied, but enclosed, marked with strange, geometric precision. And the purpose of those enclosures? Still a matter of sharp debate. South Flats Earthwork, Muskegon Company, a geometric enclosure whose purpose defense, ritual, gathering, is still uncertain. Amid the gentle topography of Muskegon County, where sandy soil meets inland lakes and oak forests rustle with wind that feels older than language, there's a hilltop that doesn't quite blend in. At first glance, it looks ordinary, just another patch of woodland in Michigan's Lower Peninsula. But seen from above, from the God's eye view that drones and LiDAR now allow, the land tells a different story. Lines, angles, curves that don't match the natural slope, raised berms that form a deliberate shape. This is the South Flats Earthwork. It is not large by modern standards, barely visible if you're walking through the trees without knowing what to look for. But it is unmistakably human-made. A low, geometric enclosure of soil, formed with care and symmetry, and older than any colonial structure in the region. It doesn't speak with grandeur, it whispers with intent. And its purpose? That's still a mystery. The South Flats Earthwork is what archaeologists call a Middle Woodland Period enclosure, dated loosely between 100 BCE and 400 CE. That's the same era as the Hopewell tradition, an era of increased social complexity, elaborate trade networks, and ceremonial mound building across the eastern United States. But South Flats doesn't fit cleanly into that tradition. It has no mound, no burials, no grand procession ways. Just the enclosure. 4 sides, low walls, a square with rounded corners, entrances, perhaps gates positioned not randomly, but aligned in ways that suggest intention. And that's where the interpretations begin to diverge. Some see defense, a fortified place used to protect a small community or gathering from outside threats. The raised embankments could have held palisades, wooden posts that made a wall, a shield against raids. In this view, South Flats was a temporary refuge, a place to retreat to in times of danger. But if that's true, it's a strange fort. It lacks the height and complexity of later defensive structures. There's no deep ditch, no weapon caches, no signs of trauma in the archaeological record. And its location on relatively open, exposed land doesn't scream tactical advantage. It's more symbolic than militarized. Others argue for ritual. In this model, South Flats was a sacred space, not lived in, but visited. A ceremonial precinct used seasonally for gatherings, rites, or celebrations. The enclosure might have marked off a clean space, separate from everyday life, where people came to participate in communal practices. Maybe feasts, maybe dances, maybe something older, stranger, harder to define. Supporting this theory is the earthworks geometry. It's too clean to be accidental. The symmetry, the proportion. Indigenous North American groups had rich astronomical and cosmological knowledge. Enclosures like this might have been aligned with solstices or cardinal directions, echoing sacred models of the universe. But again, there's a problem. So far, no clear ritual deposits have been found. No altars, no offerings, no exotic trade goods or effigy figures. If ritual activity happened here, It left few traces. That doesn't disprove the theory. It just complicates it. A third possibility: gathering. Perhaps the South Flats earthwork was a social hub, a place where dispersed bands or kin groups came together temporarily to trade, resolve disputes, perform marriages, share stories. The enclosure could have provided a neutral zone, a structured landscape where behavior was guided by tradition. In this view, the earthwork wasn't religious or defensive, it was relational. Still, this too is speculative. What we lack, more than anything, is context. South Flats sits in a part of Michigan where middle woodland activity is underdocumented. Few nearby sites provide clear parallels. The artifact record here is thin, some ceramics, some chipped stone, but nothing flashy or definitive. It's like being handed a puzzle box with most of the pieces missing and no picture on the lid. But the earthwork won't let go. Even in silence, it demands to be explained. And what's most fascinating is that this isn't an isolated case. There are more of them. Across Michigan's lower peninsula, more earthworks have been discovered similar in form, similar in mystery. Each one carved into the land with geometric precision, each one whispering of an era that saw the land not just as resource, but as canvas, a place to make marks, boundaries, meaning. What's clear is this: South Flats wasn't just somewhere. It was somewhere important. It took effort to build, time, coordination, and intent. Someone chose this hilltop. Someone decided to shape it, and then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, they walked away. But not far. Just a few counties over, another earthwork rises from the soil. This one, older, stranger, and equally unresolved. A place called Arthursburg Hill, where the earth wasn't just shaped but strategically placed. Arthursburg Hill, Earthwork Saginaw Company, early woodland, approximately 400 BC. Why this placement and plan form? Function unknown. Drive through Saginaw County today and it's easy to miss it. Arthursburg Hill, just a small rise in the otherwise flat sprawl of Michigan's Central Basin. There are no signs, no monuments, no tourism brochures pointing the way. And yet, once you know what to look for just once, you can't unsee it. The slope, the subtle curves, the unnatural stillness of the land. This is not just a hill. It's a hill with a secret. Because somewhere around 2,400 years ago, people took this hill and shaped it. Not with backhoes or plows, with hands, with purpose. They sculpted it into something deliberate, an earthwork unlike any other in the region. Not large, not flashy, but complex. A low enclosure, raised berms, shallow ditches, deliberate corners built into the hill's natural contours, like a message hidden in plain sight. And to this day, we don't really know why. The Arthursburg Hill earthwork is classified as early woodland, roughly 400 BCE. That's older than the Hopewell expansions, older than most of Michigan's ceremonial mounds. We're looking at a site that predates Roman Britain, predates written Chinese history, predates almost everything we associate with civilization in the Western world. But these people? They were already building. That alone is stunning, because the early woodland period in Michigan is typically painted with broad strokes, small, mobile bands, seasonal camps, cord-marked ceramics, the beginnings of burial mounds. Simple, transitional, but Arthursburg suggests something more layered, something more invested in place. Let's start with the layout. The earthwork isn't a perfect square, but it's not random either. It shows symmetry, spatial awareness. The berms are aligned not to cardinal directions necessarily, but to topography. Whoever designed this space understood the land. They worked with the slope, not against it. That's architectural intelligence. That's landscape engineering. And then there's the placement. Why here? Saginaw County isn't mountainous. It's low, wet, crisscrossed by rivers and shallow lakes. You'd expect seasonal camps, not fixed constructions. But Arthursburg Hill stands out. Slight elevation. Visibility in all directions. Near water, but not too near. Sheltered, but not hidden. Whoever picked this spot wasn't improvising. They were executing a plan. But a plan for what? That's the hard part. The site doesn't scream one obvious function. It's not heavily fortified, so it probably wasn't military. There's no evidence of a palisade, no gate features, no signs of conflict. And it's not a burial mound, at least not in any obvious sense. Excavations haven't turned up grave goods or human remains within the berms. So the default theory? Ceremonial enclosure. But ceremonial is archaeology's catch-all term for, we have no idea, but it's too weird to be a house. And Arthursburg fits that bill perfectly. Some have proposed it could have been an astronomical marker, a calendar built into the landscape, aligned with solstices or equinoxes. But again, without direct evidence, no petroglyphs, no artifacts indicating astronomical tools, it's speculation. Others suggest it was a social boundary, a meeting place, a neutral zone where scattered bands could come together for trade, storytelling, marriage alliances, or rituals. The shape and scale support this idea, big enough to gather, small enough to control. But then, why build it into a hill? Why shape the land at all? If it was just a meeting place, why not just meet in a clearing? Why raise berms? Why dig ditches? Unless this is key, the act of shaping the land was part of the point. This wasn't just about space, it was about transformation. Turning the natural into the intentional, marking the earth in a way that said, we were here, we did this mattered. And then they left. There's no evidence of long-term occupation, no houses, hearths, or dense artifact scatters. Whoever built Arthursburg Hill used it sparingly or left few traces of their visits. It was not a village. It was a place of focus, not function. That absence gives it weight. And the age gives it significance. Because this is one of the earliest earthworks of its kind in the region. Later mounds and enclosures, Hopewellian, Mississippian, are often larger, more complex. But Arthursburg is a precursor, a seed. Proof that long before grand earthwork centers rose in Ohio and Illinois, people in Michigan were already thinking this way, already building with dirt and meaning. And the fact that it still stands barely visible, but undeniable means it worked. It did its job, whatever that job was. But the mystery doesn't stop here, because Arthursburg isn't the only enigmatic enclosure in Michigan. Farther north, in Ogam County, another earthwork sits even more deeply buried by forest, by soil, by mystery. No berms left standing, no clear shape. Just the ghost of an idea, waiting to be understood. Ogam Earthworks, Ogam Company, cultural affiliation and use remain only partly understood. Tucked into the woods of central northeastern Michigan, where pine and hardwood mix in uneven stands and the land rolls gently without warning, lies one of the most elusive prehistoric constructions in the state. The Ogam Earthworks. Not bold, not monumental. Faint. Faint enough to miss, even if you're standing right on top of them. To most visitors, there's nothing there. A tangle of leaves, a sag in the forest floor, a few subtle rises that might just as easily be glacial leftovers or tree throws. But to the trained eye and to the handful of archaeologists who've mapped it, there's more, much more. Low embankments, circular patterns, possibly square ones, linear ridges, features that, when viewed together and from above, begin to form coherent shapes, a pattern, not made by wind, not made by water, made by people, long, long ago. These are the Ogam earthworks, and while they remain understudied, underpublicized, and buried both literally and figuratively beneath centuries of forest growth. Their presence raises enormous questions about Michigan's ancient cultural geography, questions that, frustratingly, have so far refused to resolve themselves. Let's start with what little we do know. The site sits in a transitional landscape, part upland, part wetland, rich in natural resources, game, berries, fresh water. The kind of place that would have drawn seasonal use, even long-term settlement. But the earthworks suggest something beyond simple subsistence. Their layout appears intentional. Curved and rectilinear berms now eroded to almost invisibility form what seem to be enclosed spaces. Like other enigmatic earthworks across the Midwest, these aren't massive fortifications or towering mounds. They're subtle, symbolic. Their function, if it ever was practical, was also layered with meaning. That leads to the first mystery: who built them? Unlike well-documented Hopewell sites in Ohio, or later Mississippian centers in the South, the cultural identity behind the Ogam earthworks is murky. Pottery fragments found nearby suggest a late woodland presence around 600 to 1200 CE, but the site could be older. Some have speculated early woodland. Others propose an even deeper archaic origin, based purely on the subtlety of the construction. There's no central mound, no burials, no stone tools in great numbers, just the earth shaped, enclosed, altered. If we go with a woodland-era date, then these earthworks fall into a broader pattern of ceremonial or communal constructions. Small-scale, low-profile enclosures used for gatherings, rituals, perhaps territorial signaling. But unlike sites in the Saginaw Valley or the lower Ohio, Ogam lacks clear markers of such activity. There are no caches, no ornaments, no trade goods to suggest regional integration. And that leads us to the second mystery. What was it used for? Several theories compete here, each with holes big enough to walk through. Ritual space? Maybe. But where are the signs of ceremony? Fire pits? Offerings? Burned layers? None found so far. Residential compound? Possibly. But if so, where's the trash? The middens? The debris from daily life? Fortification? Unlikely. The walls are too low, too open, and there's no evidence of conflict. What's left is ambiguity. Perhaps the Ogam earthworks served as land memory, a place less about physical activity and more about presence, a marker, a claim, a statement in soil that said, "Here we are, here we return, this place is known to us." That idea fits with indigenous traditions, where land is not just occupied, but remembered, where space is mapped not only with feet, but with stories, where landscape holds narrative. The act of shaping the earth, of raising berms or carving ditches, isn't always about utility. Sometimes it's about embedding meaning. And yet, the site resists closure. Unlike more famous earthworks that have been fully excavated and mapped, Ogam's remains are too degraded for quick answers. Decades of erosion, logging, and neglect have taken their toll. The site has been documented, yes, but barely. Few sustained studies, fewer protections. Most of what we know comes from LiDAR imaging, small shovel tests, and the whispered hunches of archaeologists trying to coax clarity from faint scars in the ground. And still, the site holds on. It remains intact enough to suggest, scale enough to show that someone, long ago, put significant effort into its creation. Enough to say this wasn't a fluke, it was a plan. Executed by a group that understood the land and how to shape it with minimal tools and maximum meaning. But the best proof that Ogam mattered might be this: it wasn't alone. Another earthwork, less studied, less preserved, lies to the northwest in Missaukee County. Sparse data, sparse excavation, but like Ogam, it hints at a forgotten cultural pattern in prehistoric Michigan. A pattern that says, across this forested land, people once carved memory into the soil, One enclosure at a time. Boven Earthworks, Misaki Company. Sparse investigations leave the earthworks' purpose unresolved. Out in the quieter zones of Michigan's north-central Lower Peninsula, in Misaki County, the trees grow thick and the soil runs deep. It's the kind of place where silence lingers, where towns are far apart, and where the land seems untouched, at least at first glance. But underneath the surface, tucked between pine roots and forgotten field lines, lies one of Michigan's most overlooked prehistoric enigmas, the Boven Earthworks. You won't find much written about it. There are no interpretive signs, no detailed site maps hanging in local museums. In fact, the average resident of Misaki County has probably never heard of it. But it's there. Quiet, subtle, persistent. The earthworks themselves, such as they are faint, barely visible to the naked eye. What remains are low rises in the forest floor, shallow depressions, and irregular but patterned contours that clearly don't belong to the natural lay of the land. To someone just passing through, they might appear as nothing more than glacial artifacts or quirks of erosion. But aerial imagery and early survey notes tell a different story. They were built. And that opens a Pandora's box of questions. Because the moment you recognize the earthworks as artificial, deliberate, cultural, you enter the realm of interpretation. And Boven, more than most sites in Michigan, refuses to play along. The first major challenge is lack of excavation. Unlike other earthworks that have seen multiple digs over decades, South Flats, Arthursburg, Norton Boven has been largely left alone. Whether due to remoteness, disinterest, or simple academic oversight, it remains in what archaeologists call a minimally disturbed state. That's good for preservation, not so good for answers. What little we do know comes from aerial surveys and brief walkover assessments. These revealed that the Boven earthworks consist of what appears to be a roughly rectangular or oval-shaped enclosure, with low earthen walls surrounding a central space. There may be multiple connected features, smaller embankments or ditches branching from the main form, but the details are obscured by vegetation and time. There's no consensus on age. Pottery sherds found nearby suggest a woodland period presence, but that's about as vague as it gets. Woodland in Michigan spans over 1,000 years. The site could be early woodland, contemporaneous with Arthursburg. It could be middle woodland, linked, perhaps loosely, to the Hopewellian interaction sphere. Or it could be late woodland, from a time of regional consolidation and shifting social practices. So we're left with a shaped landscape and almost no context. No carbon dates, no trade goods, no burials, just the shape. So what was it for? Let's review the usual suspects. Defensive structure? Not likely. The embankments aren't high enough, and there's no associated ditch that would make a wall truly effective. The placement isn't particularly strategic. No high ground advantage, no proximity to choke points or defensible ridges. Settlement site? Also unlikely. There are no hearths, no housing footprints, no artifact concentrations typical of long-term domestic use, no garbage, no post holes, just earth. That leaves the same ambiguous middle ground we've seen before, ritual or ceremonial use. But even that is slippery. What does ritual mean in this context? Seasonal gatherings? Feasts? Storytelling? Dream quests? Solar alignments? All we know is that people moved a lot of dirt, shaped it into deliberate forms, and then, apparently, left without a mess. And perhaps that's the clue. The very cleanliness of the Boven earthworks might indicate they were designed for something specific, something focused. You don't build an enclosure, use it once or twice a year, and then leave behind every pot shard and fishbone. You clean up, you preserve, you treat the space with care. In this way, Boven might be more than a site. It might be a statement, a place made sacred through action, then abandoned respectfully. And that would place it in a tradition of earth as text, a practice where landscapes are written upon, not with ink, but with geometry and intention, The shape itself is the language. The enclosure says something about territory, identity, cosmology, but we've lost the grammar. It's also possible that Boven was part of a larger constellation of sites, a node in a network. Perhaps there were trails connecting it to other enclosures, or seasonal circuits that brought people here in cycles we no longer understand. The silence between the sites Boven, Ogam, Arthursburg may be the silence of forgotten movement. But silence is still something. It leaves a space for questions to echo. And if there's one question that resonates louder than most in Michigan's prehistoric landscape, it's the question of the dead. Who was buried, where, and why? Because just west of here, on the banks of the Grand River, lie a series of mounds that were excavated. And what they reveal is staggering not because of what was found, but because of what it tells us about who they were connected to. Norton Mounds, Grand Rapids, Hopewell, a major mortuary center. How much was locally driven versus tied to distant Hopewell networks? Along the western edge of Michigan, where the Grand River meanders toward Lake Michigan in slow, winding loops, a set of low, earthen mounds rises from the floodplain, or at least, they used to rise. Today, the Norton Mounds are mostly flattened, their original forms beaten down by centuries of plow and shovel, construction and erosion. But when they stood intact 30 mounds in a broad, organized complex, they were among the most impressive burial sites in the Midwest. And the most mysterious. Because, while Norton clearly fits into the broader tradition of Hopewell mortuary architecture, complete with elaborate burials, exotic grave goods, and architectural planning, it also stands apart. Not in scale, necessarily, but in cultural flavor. There's something distinct about the Norton Mounds, something local, something that doesn't quite match what we see in Ohio's more famous Hopewell sites. So the question is this: how much of Norton's grandeur was imported, and how much was homegrown? Let's begin with the obvious. Norton was a mortuary center. People weren't living on the mounds. They came here to bury the dead, carefully, repeatedly, over generations. Each burial was a statement, an act of remembrance, yes, but also a political and spiritual declaration. The dead weren't just interred, they were placed, positioned, and equipped with copper, with mica, with marine shell, with obsidian. Let that sink in. Obsidian, from the Rocky Mountains, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from Lake Superior, mica from Appalachia, all gathered in western Michigan for the purpose of burying the dead. That kind of trade doesn't happen without networks and big ones. It links Norton directly into the Hopewell interaction sphere, a continental web of exchange and ideology that spread materials, motifs, and ceremonial practices from one end of the eastern woodlands to the other. It wasn't an empire. It wasn't a market. But it was a system complex, fluid, and deeply symbolic. And yet, within that system, Norton doesn't feel like a carbon copy. The mounds are smaller than some of the Ohio Valley's giants. The burial patterns, while similar, show subtle deviations. The goods, while impressive, don't always match the high art aesthetic of places like Mound City or Sipe. Norton feels hybrid, participatory, yes, but also autonomous. In other words, the people of the Grand River weren't just borrowing Hopewell culture, they were adapting it, shaping it to fit local needs, beliefs, and identities. This leads to the next layer of mystery. Who exactly was buried here? Excavations have revealed multiple burials within each mound, some primary, others secondary. Bodies laid out or cremated, some buried with wealth, others with none. Men, women, children. The social hierarchy is present, but not absolute. There are no kings here, no royal tombs, but there is status. And the variety suggests a community with layers, roles, responsibilities, possibly even ritual offices. But what kind of community? We don't know where these people lived, exactly. The residential sites associated with Norton remain elusive. Were they nearby? Were they scattered along the Grand River? Did groups come here from afar to bury their elite, or was this a more closed, local affair? The answer matters, because it speaks to whether Norton was a regional center or a pan-tribal shrine. Some archaeologists lean toward the former, a central place for a relatively cohesive group, perhaps an ancestral community whose leaders had access to long-distance trade and spiritual knowledge. Others think it might have been a gathering ground, where multiple bands or tribes converged to honor the dead, exchange goods, and reinforce alliances. Either way, the implications are massive, because Norton suggests that West Michigan wasn't just a peripheral zone, a place where big ideas drifted in from the heartland. It was active, engaged, shaping and reshaping ceremonial life in ways that still ripple through the archaeological record. And then, like many Hopewell sites, it faded. The burials stop, the mounds go silent, trade wanes, ideology shifts. Whether from climate change, political upheaval, or evolving spiritual beliefs, the Hopewell world contracts, and Norton contracts with it. But it doesn't vanish completely. The memory lingers in the landscape, and in the presence of those exotic goods in the obsidian, the copper, the marine shell, there's a hint of something older, a connection stretching not just across rivers and forests, but across time. Because the artifacts in those mounds came from somewhere. They passed through hands, through stories, through systems that began long before Hopewell and lasted long after. And that brings us to one of the deepest mysteries of Michigan's prehistory. Not what was buried, but what came before the burial, the first signs, the earliest arrival, the oldest site in the state, hidden beneath ordinary farmland, announced only in 2021. And it changed everything. Michigan's first definitive Clovis site, announced 2021. Why are early sites so rare here, and what does that say about earliest settlement? In 2021, a quiet paper made a loud noise in the world of North American archaeology. It didn't announce the discovery of a new pyramid or a lost city under the lakes. No gold, no tomb. Just a few chipped stones precisely shaped, unmistakably ancient. But those stones told a story Michigan had been waiting to hear for decades. They were Clovis points, the first definitive Clovis site ever confirmed in the state of Michigan. And with that, a door opened, if only slightly, onto one of the state's most profound prehistoric mysteries. Who were the first people here, and why is there so little left of them? Let's rewind. The Clovis culture, named after a site in New Mexico, is the earliest widespread archaeological culture in North America. They appear around 13,000 years ago, right at the end of the last ice age. Their stone tools, especially their fluted projectile points, are so distinctive, so finely made, that finding one is like hearing a voice from the deep past. Clovis people weren't just wandering foragers. They were strategists, hunters of mammoth and mastodon, travelers who mapped entire continents with their feet. They've been found across much of the continental U.S., from Florida to Montana, and yet, for a long time, not in Michigan. At least, not definitively. There were surface finds, Clovis-like points picked up by collectors or noted in old records, but no contextual site. No place where Clovis tools were found in undisturbed soil, dated alongside other materials, in a way that allowed confident conclusions about time and behavior. Michigan's early prehistory felt like a blank spot on the Clovis map, until 2021. That year, archaeologists finally confirmed a buried Clovis horizon in Michigan. The tools were fluted, expertly shaped, and consistent with classic Clovis forms. They came from a secure context, undisturbed and datable. It wasn't just a fluke, it was a site. This changed everything, because it confirmed what many had long suspected, that Michigan, despite its archaeological silence, had been part of the Clovis world all along. It wasn't an edge. It wasn't a latecomer. It had just been hiding. But why? Why are Clovis sites so rare here? Part of the answer is environmental. When Clovis people were active, Michigan was just emerging from the grip of the last glaciation. Much of the northern part of the state was still under ice. Southern Michigan was open, but soggy, filled with glacial meltwater, unstable sediments, and volatile shorelines. The landscape was in flux. Rivers shifted, lakes formed and drained. Forests advanced and retreated. That kind of instability makes it hard to preserve archaeological sites, especially ones that were never permanent settlements to begin with. Clovis groups were mobile. Their camps were small, temporary, and often left few traces. A single flood, a shifting river, or even a thick growth of forest could erase an entire season of human activity from the record. Then there's the soil itself. Michigan's acidic, sandy soils don't preserve organic materials well. Bone, wood, and leather degrade quickly. That leaves only the stone, the tools, the flakes, the points. And even those can be scattered, trampled, or mistaken for later periods. Without clear stratigraphy, even a perfect Clovis point can't speak its full story. And let's not forget visibility. Much of Michigan's southern lower peninsula, the most likely place to find early sites, is under farmland, cities, roads, or private property. There's no desert pavement here to expose ancient artifacts. Just layers of human development built atop the old world. We've been walking over Clovis for centuries and barely noticed. So when a site does emerge from a field, a bank, a gravel pit, it feels like a revelation. And what does the Clovis site tell us? That the first Michiganders were part of a larger narrative. They weren't isolated, backward, or peripheral. They were among the first to walk these woods and watch the mastodons roam. They brought with them a technology honed across thousands of miles, a flint-knapping tradition that required skill, patience, and inherited knowledge. And they didn't just pass through. They stayed. They camped. They hunted. They made things. Their presence confirms that Michigan was already being mapped by human minds as the Ice Age ended, already understood as a place worth knowing. But they're hard to find, silent, scattered, like a song played at a frequency too low for us to hear. And yet, every once in a while, the ground speaks. But even more intriguing than the first confirmed Clovis point is what happens after Clovis, when their technology fades and something new begins. A shift not just in tools, but in distribution. Because Michigan's earliest finds aren't just rare, they cluster. They appear mostly in one specific region of the state, and the reasons why remain just as puzzling as the Clovis silence that came before. Paleoindian finds cluster, mainly in the southern lower peninsula environment. Sampling bias, or behavior, still debated. Take a pin, stick it in a map of Michigan, and then toss a handful of tiny stone points across the surface. Where do they land? If those points are Paleoindian, dating to around 13,000 to 10,000 years ago, most of them will land south of an invisible line, somewhere below Saginaw Bay, closer to Indiana and Ohio than to the wild forests of the Upper Peninsula. It's not just a hunch, it's a pattern, a very strange, very persistent one. Nearly all of Michigan's confirmed early Paleoindian finds, Clovis and post-Clovis alike, come from the southern lower peninsula. That includes isolated points, small surface scatters, and, in very rare cases, intact buried sites. It's where the data clumps. And for a culture that probably moved across enormous distances, that kind of regional clustering demands an answer. Is it real, or is it a trick of the record? That question has dogged archaeologists for decades, because when we say Paleoindian sites cluster in the south, we're not talking about a few extra finds here or there. We're talking about disproportionate density. The southern counties, Calhoun, Jackson, Lenawee, Washtenaw, have produced more early points than the entire northern half of the state combined. And that's not what you'd expect from people who followed megafauna. Let's start with the environment. At the end of the Ice Age, northern Michigan was still recovering from glaciation. The Upper Peninsula and northern Lower Peninsula were partially under ice or tundra-like conditions. Not barren, exactly, but raw, young, with limited vegetation, unstable soils, and rapidly shifting water levels. By contrast, the southern Lower Peninsula was open, richer in vegetation, more habitable. Lakes were forming, but not yet enormous. The terrain was a mix of parkland, wetlands, and conifer forest, a mosaic that would have supported a wide range of game. If you were a Paleoindian group chasing herds of caribou or early deer, this would have been prime country. So maybe the clustering is a reflection of where people actually lived. In this view, the southern Lower Peninsula wasn't just more comfortable. It was a hub, a place where food was plentiful, terrain was familiar, and movement was efficient. The nearby Maumee and Huron basins connected to broader Midwestern trade and migration routes. The rivers were highways. The glacial outwash plains were open ground for movement and hunting. But there's another possibility. Sampling bias. Much of Michigan's early archaeological record comes from surface finds. That is, artifacts found accidentally by farmers, construction crews, or amateur collectors. And most of Michigan's agriculture and development has happened in the southern counties. That's where the cities are. The farms, the highways, the bulldozers. It's where people have been disturbing the soil for over 2 centuries. So maybe Paleoindians were all over Michigan, but we just haven't dug in the right places. In the north, the soil is deeper, the forests are thicker, the land is less disturbed. Sites could be buried under meters of silt or forest duff. Or they could lie underwater, lost to glacial lake shifts and post-glacial flooding. It's not that people weren't there, it's that we can't see them. Or maybe it's both. Maybe southern Michigan really was a population center, and maybe northern Michigan's Paleoindian record is still waiting to be found. But there's a third angle, a behavioral one. What if the southern Lower Peninsula wasn't just more habitable, it was special, a cultural center, a place where early peoples not only survived, but gathered. A seasonal convergence zone where different groups met to trade, to share stories, to bury their dead. The high concentration of fluted points and large bifaces might reflect more than just daily life. It might reflect ceremony, memory, identity. And if that's the case, then what we're seeing in the distribution of Paleoindian finds isn't just a record of movement, it's a map of meaning, a pattern carved not just by tools, but by intention. Still, the mystery remains. The further north you go, the quieter the Paleoindian record becomes. And that silence only gets louder when we consider what else lived in the region during those early days. Not just people, but megafauna. Giant, shaggy, tusked beasts roaming the forests and wetlands, and leaving behind bones that, in Michigan, seem to show something strange. Not just death, but interaction. And possibly something more. Mastodon butchery. Evidence in Michigan. Hunting versus scavenging and the scale of human megafauna interaction remain contested. Long before the mounds were built, long before copper gleamed in trade routes and earthworks cut lines into the soil, there were megafauna. Massive, lumbering, thick-haired creatures that made the forests of Michigan creak beneath their weight. And chief among them, Michigan's paleontological headliner was the Mastodon. If you live in the state long enough, you'll see one. Not alive, of course, but in museums, in murals, in roadside signs. Mastodons are to Michigan what T-Rex is to the Dakotas. The state is positively littered with them, partial skeletons in backyards, tusks unearthed during construction, bone beds buried beneath bogs. Mastodons were here, in astonishing numbers. But one question still looms. unsettled, and slightly unsettling. Did humans hunt them? Or just find them after death? That might sound like a small distinction. Dead is dead, after all, but in archaeology, that distinction changes everything. If people hunted mastodons in Michigan, it means they had the coordination, tools, and nerve to take down multi-ton animals in dense forests. It means their lives and culture were intertwined with these beasts. It means survival wasn't just about berries and fish, it was about chasing giants. If they scavenged, that's a different story. It suggests opportunism. That early people may have stumbled upon dead or dying mastodons and stripped them for what they could. Meat, marrow, hide, ivory. Still smart, still adaptive, but less direct. Less confrontational. And this is where the evidence gets sticky. Because Michigan has both the bones and the tools, but rarely together. Thousands of mastodon bones have been found. Some with cut marks. Some associated with stone tools. Some even buried in ways that suggest human interaction. But rarely do we get the perfect, clean package. An intact kill site with skeleton, tools, camp, and dated context, all untouched and unambiguous. Instead, we get puzzles. Take the cut marks. Yes, some mastodon bones in Michigan show signs of stone tool butchery. Long, linear incisions on ribs and limb bones, exactly where you'd expect if someone was slicing meat or disarticulating a carcass. That's not natural damage. That's not wolf teeth or river wear. That's a human hand, wielding a sharp edge, knowing where to cut. But cut marks alone don't prove hunting. The mastodon could have died naturally of old age, of disease, of injury, and the butchery came later, post-mortem, opportunistic, a free meal. Still, some sites make the hunting hypothesis harder to dismiss. There are clusters of finds, places where mastodon remains are not isolated, but gathered, where multiple individuals show similar treatment, where nearby tools match the technology of early humans Clovis and later Paleoindian styles. In one case, a mastodon skull with a broken tusk was found in proximity to chipped stone tools and what appeared to be a concentration of fire-cracked rock. Was it a kill site? A processing site? Or coincidence? The debate rages in academic circles. Some archaeologists argue that the density of mastodon remains, combined with the sporadic evidence of tool use, points toward a low-frequency hunting relationship. That is, humans did occasionally hunt mastodons, but it was rare, risky, not routine. They may have targeted young, old, or wounded animals. Or they may have employed ambush strategies, driving a mastodon into mud, a lake, a trap. Others push back. They say the evidence is too thin. That true kill sites, like those found in the plains states with mammoths, just don't exist in Michigan. That the people here probably scavenged, not hunted. That the landscape didn't support big game-focused lifeways the way other regions did. But there's a third possibility. That the story is more complex. That early humans in Michigan had a diverse strategy. Sometimes scavenging, sometimes hunting, always adapting. Maybe they only hunted mastodons in certain seasons. Maybe they did so ritually, only when certain social conditions were met. Maybe the importance of mastodons wasn't about calories at all, but about memory, myth, and meaning. After all, these were the largest creatures on the landscape. They shaped how people moved, how they imagined the land. Even if rarely hunted, they would have loomed large in the minds of those who walked beside them. And as they disappeared, whether from climate, hunting pressure, or ecological domino effects, people remembered. They carried mastodon bones, they carved tusk, they buried teeth. The final twist? In Michigan, mastodon remains aren't just frequent, they're exceptionally frequent. More than almost anywhere else. Which raises a bigger, bolder question. Why here? What made this region so full of these ancient beasts? And what does their density say about the people who lived among them? That question leads us deeper, not just into bones, but into entire landscapes of extinction. Michigan's unusually high number of mastodon, mammoth remains. What this density really implies about people on the landscape. Let's talk numbers, not just bones, but how many bones. Because when it comes to mastodon and mammoth remains, Michigan isn't just well-stocked, it's practically overflowing. By some counts, Michigan has more individual mastodon remains per square mile than almost any other state in the U.S. Nearly 300 confirmed mastodon sites, dozens of mammoths, bones in fields, tusks in gravel pits, teeth in bogs, ribs in museum basements. It's not a statistical fluke, it's a geological reality, and it begs the question, what happened here? Why does Michigan, of all places, hold such an outsized share of Ice Age giants? And more importantly, what does that tell us about the people who lived alongside them? Let's start with the land. During the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, Michigan was an ecological patchwork. As the glaciers retreated, they left behind a shattered mosaic of terrain: moraines, outwash plains, kettle lakes, swampy lowlands, wind-swept ridges. These post-glacial environments didn't just grow back into wilderness, they created a kind of megafaunal paradise. Mastodons in particular loved Michigan. They weren't like mammoths, who preferred open grasslands. Mastodons were browsers, forest elephants. They thrived on shrubs, twigs, spruce, cedar, and birch. And Michigan, in the millennia after glaciation, became one of the richest boreal and mixed forest environments in North America. The wetlands were ideal. The forests were dense but productive. Seasonal transitions were dramatic but survivable. The state became a mastodon buffet. Which is why we keep finding them in bogs, swamps, old riverbanks. Mastodons often died in waterlogged environments, where soft sediment and anaerobic conditions preserved their bones unusually well. That preservation bias helps explain part of the abundance, but not all of it. Because here's the twist. The density of mastodon finds in Michigan isn't just about where they died. It's about how many of them were living here to begin with. The numbers suggest a regional population that was far denser than most of their kindred across the continent. That means that when early humans arrived in this landscape, whether Clovis, pre-Clovis, or late Paleoindian, they weren't just finding a stray mastodon or two. They were walking into a world where mastodons were part of the environment, everywhere, herds in the woods, tracks by the rivers, trails beaten into the underbrush by generations of tusk and foot. And that kind of presence affects everything. Even if people didn't hunt them often, they interacted with them constantly. They followed their movements, watched their behavior, maybe even learned their rhythms when they calved, when they migrated, when they returned to old wallows or salt licks. You don't live in a land of giants and ignore them. But here's where the story darkens. Because mastodons didn't last. Somewhere between 12,700 and 10,000 years ago, they disappeared from Michigan's record. Gone. Extinct. Whether it was hunting pressure, climate stress, or a tipping point combination of both, they vanished. And that mass disappearance changed everything. For the animals, obviously, but also for the humans. When the mastodons left, so did the entire ecosystem they helped shape. The forests changed, the wetlands changed, the role of humans changed, and the archaeological record starts to reflect that shift. Sites become smaller, more dispersed, tools get lighter, diets diversify. Some researchers argue that Michigan's high number of mastodon finds could be the smoking gun of overexploitation. That maybe humans here were hunting them, and hard. That the density of finds doesn't reflect a stable population, it reflects the graveyard of a collapse. Others disagree. They point to the lack of unambiguous kill sites, the patchy human presence, the sporadic nature of tool finds. Maybe Michigan's mastodons were simply victims of bad timing, of climate they couldn't adapt to, of shrinking ranges and unlucky storms, but in either case, the people had to respond. And that's the real story. Because as the megafauna vanished, human strategy changed. They couldn't rely on 8,000 pounds of meat anymore. They had to become more mobile, more diverse in diet, more creative in technology. And that shift from Ice Age megafauna hunters to archaic era generalists is one of the most profound transitions in human history. It's not marked by a single event, not a massacre, not a breakthrough, just a slow, difficult recalibration. And beneath it all, those bones remain. In fields, in bogs, in dusty drawers, each one a snapshot of a vanished world, a reminder that the first Michiganders didn't walk a quiet, tame landscape. They walked among giants. But when those giants fell, new landscapes opened up, new possibilities, new mysteries. And some of the most tantalizing ones still lie underwater, not in rivers or lakes, but in shelves. Ancient land now drowned, still holding traces of those who adapted and moved on. Early hunters beneath the Great Lakes. How much archaeology still lies on drowned shelves, and what lifeways it will reveal. If the forests of Michigan hold secrets in their soil, then the lakes hold entire chapters of prehistory written, erased, and preserved in silence. Because thousands of years ago, what is now underwater wasn't always wet. The Great Lakes, those vast, inland seas that now define Michigan's identity, were once a scattered collection of low-stand basins and dry land corridors, created during periods when glacial meltwater hadn't yet filled the basins. The waters rose and fell like breath, reshaping coastlines, drowning valleys, and exposing shelves of land that were, for a time, perfectly habitable. And humans were there. We know this not because we've uncovered ancient cities under the lake, though that's the dream, but because every few years something breaks the surface of the mystery. A drive lane here, a campsite there, a tool found beneath a century's worth of sediment. Each one a ripple that hints at a submerged world. So, here's the real question. How much of Michigan's earliest human history is underwater? The answer, though still forming, is beginning to shake assumptions. Because the more researchers look, especially in places like Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and their connecting straits, the more they realize that large stretches of submerged shelf were once dry land during key windows of human migration and adaptation. In particular, during the Lake Stanley low stand, roughly 10,000 to 7,000 years ago, water levels dropped dramatically, exposing broad plains that would have been prime real estate for hunter-gatherers. These weren't tiny islands or inhospitable wastelands. They were habitable landscapes, miles wide, rich in caribou, freshwater, wood, and stone. Natural corridors between what we now think of as the upper and lower peninsulas, and in some cases, we found the footprints. Under Lake Huron, the famous Drop 45 drive lane revealed an ancient hunting structure, stone lanes used to channel migrating caribou into kill zones, perfectly preserved, entirely submerged. That site alone proved beyond doubt that people not only used these dry lake beds, they engineered them. And if there's one, there are likely more. A lot more. Underwater archaeologists have barely scratched the surface of the submerged shelves. The challenges are enormous. Visibility is low. The depths are tricky, and much of the potential terrain is covered in sediment or aquatic growth. Mapping these areas requires sonar, remote sensing, divers, and months of painstaking planning. But even with limited access, the results have been startling. Stone arrangements, fire-cracked rock, tool debris, possible habitation layers sealed beneath layers of silt. Even small wood fragments, preserved in oxygen-depleted zones, potential remnants of structures or tools. Each of these is a clue. Together, they point toward a profound realization. Michigan's earliest lifeways, its first hunters, its first migrations, Its earliest knowledge of the land may be underwater, invisible from the surface, but perfectly intact beneath. Why does this matter? Because traditional archaeology has often focused on what's found on land: burial mounds, village sites, hearths, quarries. But those are often from later periods, once lake levels stabilized, once agriculture took hold, once societies grew more sedentary. The earliest chapters, those of the Paleoindian and archaic pioneers, are harder to find. Their sites were often near water, and those waters have moved. What this means is that some of the most critical gaps in Michigan's prehistoric timeline might only be filled by underwater exploration. We're not just talking about tools and bones. We're talking about landscapes. Imagine walking trails still preserved beneath the lakebed, campsites with fire pits surrounded by flakes of chert, caribou kill sites complete with butchered bone and stone scrapers, perhaps even early forms of dwellings, hollowed pits, post molds, simple shelters. It's not fantasy. It's entirely plausible, based on what's already been found. And then comes the bigger question. Who were these people? If they moved across submerged land bridges and hunted along drowned ridges, what does that say about their adaptability, their mobility, their sense of place and direction? These weren't people guessing their way through a wilderness. They were organized, strategic, familiar with seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and landscape memory. What we uncover underwater doesn't just expand the map, it redefines it. It challenges the assumption that early humans were scattered and primitive. Instead, it paints a picture of deep familiarity with shifting environments, a willingness to follow the land wherever it went, even as that land was swallowed by water. And as lake levels rose, they didn't vanish. They moved, adapted, transferred knowledge inland, left behind only the most durable traces. We're now beginning to recover those traces, but we've only just begun. Because elsewhere in Michigan's North Woods, away from the drowned shelves and lakefront camps, lie rivers where stone tools and wooden stakes hint at something just as remarkable. Ancient fishing systems, prehistoric engineering, lines across the water, stone weirs, suspected prehistoric stone fish weirs on Upper Peninsula streams, dating and extent are largely unknown. Follow the flow of a northern Michigan stream, cold, narrow, fast in some places, sluggish in others, and you may stumble across a pattern in the rocks. Nothing flashy. Just a curious V-shaped alignment beneath the surface. Oddly precise, too symmetrical to be random. A few paces long, often partially buried or overgrown. Sometimes a single row. Sometimes multiple rows converging in a silent funnel. You'd be forgiven for thinking it's natural, or a remnant of some colonial settler's handiwork. But if you squint, if you look at it with the right kind of imagination, and maybe a few thousand years of hindsight, it starts to look like something far older. A fish weir, and not a modern one. These stone features, scattered across small rivers and streams in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, may be among the most underappreciated archaeological structures in the state. They are subtle, they are fragile, and if they are what they appear to be, they could represent one of the oldest engineering traditions in the Great Lakes region. But here's the problem. They're nearly impossible to date. Let's rewind. Fish weirs are one of the oldest known fishing technologies on Earth. They work by guiding fish, especially during spawning runs, into narrow channels, traps, or holding pools where they can be easily caught. The technology doesn't require metal, or even fire, just knowledge of stream flow, fish migration, and hydrodynamics. Knowledge passed down, not just over generations, but over millennia. And in the UP, where rivers snake through bedrock and glacial till, where whitefish and trout still make ancient journeys upstream, the stage is perfectly set. But recognizing a prehistoric fish weir is harder than it sounds. The streams themselves are constantly shifting, eroding banks, depositing silt, moving rocks, Beaver dams come and go. Ice pushes boulders downstream. Spring floods rearrange everything. What begins as a clean V of stones can, within a decade or two, become an indecipherable jumble. Which is exactly the state in which most of these suspected weirs are found today. Fragmentary, buried, choked with vegetation, or overlaid by modern infrastructure. But occasionally, especially in remote or less developed areas, the pattern remains. The stones still hold their shape, angled upriver, pointed like an arrowhead, designed to steer fish toward a narrow gap where baskets, spears, or hand nets could have been used. And if you start mapping these features, a picture begins to emerge. Not a random scatter, a system. Multiple weirs in the same drainage, similar designs, similar placements just downstream from rapids or bottlenecks. Some even show signs of repair, modification, or rebuilding over time. So who built them? That's where the mystery deepens. Because the Upper Peninsula has a long and tangled human history. It was occupied by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before European contact. By the time French explorers arrived in the 1602, the Ojibwe and their neighbors already had deep knowledge of these waters. But the stone weirs might be much older. We're talking late Archaic, maybe even earlier. There's no way to carbon date a rock wall in a stream. Organic material like wooden stakes, woven baskets, or fish bones rarely survives the wet, dynamic environment. And few formal excavations have been undertaken. Most of what we know about these weirs is based on inference, oral tradition, and pattern recognition. Still, the circumstantial case is strong. The locations line up with traditional fishing sites. The design matches prehistoric weir systems used around the world, and the labor investment, dozens or hundreds of carefully placed stones, implies communal effort. These weren't casual constructions, they were infrastructure. Seasonal, yes, but crucial. Because fish were a major staple in the pre-agricultural diet of Great Lakes peoples, especially in the shoulder seasons, spring and fall, when other food sources became scarce. A well-placed weir could turn a hungry month into a feast. It could support a camp, or a clan, or an entire seasonal gathering. And, unlike big game hunting, it didn't require travel or risk. Fish weirs represent knowledge, stability, a kind of confidence that the river will keep flowing, that the fish will keep returning, that the old ways will keep working. Which is why it's so strange how little we know about them in Michigan. They've been noticed, noted, sketched in field reports, mentioned in oral histories, but they remain largely unstudied, perhaps because they're low profile, perhaps because they blur the line between natural and cultural, perhaps because they don't fit the more dramatic narratives of mounds and copper and megafauna. But that's the power of these silent structures. They remind us that prehistoric life wasn't just epic, it was routine. People lived here, year after year, because they knew how to make the land work for them, quietly, sustainably, ingeniously. And those quiet skills leave quieter traces. Still, sometimes those traces aren't quite so small. Because on an island just offshore on Bois Blanc, north of the Lower Peninsula, there's a site that combines everything: fishing, burial, copper working, and mystery. A site so layered it feels like an entire culture collapsed into one place. Juntunen site, Bois Blanc Island, ossuaries, intensive fishing, and copper working. The origins of these mortuary traditions are still probed. Just off the northern tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, in the chill blue stretch of water between the mainland and the Upper Peninsula, sits Bois Blanc Island, quiet, heavily forested. The kind of place that feels untouched, not because it is, but because it hides its history well. Ferries pass it, boats hug its shoreline, but few people land and stay. It doesn't boast the name recognition of Mackinac Island, its glamorous neighbor to the west. No fudge, no tourists, no carriages. But it does have a secret. Because Bois Blanc Island is home to one of the most complex, confounding, and culturally rich prehistoric sites in the state, the Juntunen site. It's a place that doesn't fit easily into categories. A burial site, but not just that. A fishing camp, but also a metallurgical workshop. An island outpost, but one deeply connected to mainland networks. It's as if someone took the entire late woodland period and buried it in one shoreline village. And even now, with decades of study and excavation, it still refuses to yield all its answers. Let's start with the ossuaries. The Juntunen site contains multiple burial pits, communal ossuaries, where human remains were placed in groups. This is not a case of individual graves or elite tombs. It's a pattern of mass burial, where dozens of individuals, men, women, children were laid together in shared spaces. Some pits were tightly packed, others more dispersed. Some had associated artifacts, copper ornaments, shell beads, pipes. Others were relatively bare. The variation suggests a complex social landscape, perhaps egalitarian in some respects, but marked by distinctions in status, role, or ritual. Ossuary burial itself is a big deal. It suggests delayed burial practices where bodies were first exposed or stored, then gathered later for communal interment. That kind of practice requires social cohesion, agreement, belief, a shared understanding that the dead deserve a second ceremony, a return to the earth in unison. And it's not random. The Juntunen ossuaries seem to follow patterns. Placement near the edge of the habitation zone. Consistent orientation. Sometimes stratified, indicating repeated use over years, possibly generations. This was not a one-time event. It was a tradition. And the tradition wasn't isolated. Similar mortuary patterns appear across the Great Lakes during the late woodland period. But the Juntunen site shows an especially rich example enhanced by what lies nearby. Because not far from the ossuaries, sometimes within a stone's throw, are layers upon layers of fish remains. Whitefish, sturgeon, perch, bones and scales packed into middens. Some burned, some whole, some split for marrow. These weren't casual meals. This was intensive fishing on an industrial scale. Netting, smoking, drying, storage. Evidence suggests seasonal occupation, most likely during spawning runs, when fish could be harvested in massive numbers. And the location couldn't be better. Bois Blanc sits at a critical junction in the Great Lakes ecosystem. It overlooks the Straits of Mackinac, one of the most productive aquatic corridors in the region. A bottleneck where fish are forced into narrow passage, perfect for netting and trapping. It's a place where a well-organized community could feed itself and possibly others through meticulous planning and execution. Which raises the question, who were they feeding? Were these fish stored for winter? Traded to inland groups? Used to support visiting clans during burial ceremonies? We don't know, but we do know this. Fish weren't the only resource pulled from the land and water. The Juntunen site also yielded signs of copper working. Not massive mining pits like those found on Isle Royale, not smelting or metallurgy in the modern sense, but flakes, bits, and finished artifacts, beads, tools, decorative items, suggesting that people here were not just receiving copper through trade, they were reshaping it, cold hammering it, working it into forms that mattered. And that changes things. It turns Juntunen from a passive recipient of trade goods into an active participant in the region's economic and symbolic systems. This was a site where goods came in, were transformed, and were likely sent out. Fish, copper, ceremonial knowledge. The implications are huge. It suggests that even relatively small, seasonal sites could hold central roles in cultural life. That burial, subsistence, and craft were deeply intertwined. That islands often seen as peripheral could serve as hubs for connection, memory, and innovation. And yet, despite all this, the site is still only partially understood. We don't know exactly where the people came from, or where they went. We don't know how long the mortuary practice lasted, or why it stopped. We don't know whether Juntunan was a central place for a specific group or a shared ground for many. What we do know is this: it mattered. And it was far from alone, because just south, along the Street Joseph River, lies another site more expansive, more permanent, where village life paints a different picture. A picture of change, contact, and evolving identity. Moccasin Bluff, Street Joseph River, multi-component village. Exact trajectories of cultural contact and change remain murky. Southwest Michigan, with its fertile floodplains and gentle terrain, has always been prime real estate for people who understood how to live off the land. Today it's cornfields and subdivisions. A century ago it was lumber. A few centuries before that, orchards, missions, trade posts. But wind the clock back even further, and what you find is a village. Not a campsite, not a hunting station. A real, settled community. One that rose, evolved, and eventually vanished. That village was Moccasin Bluff. Perched above a bend in the Street Joseph River, Moccasin Bluff is what archaeologists call a multi-component site. A place with multiple layers of human occupation built up over centuries. It's a literal layer cake of prehistoric life, with the remnants of several cultural groups stacked on top of one another like sediment in a slow human-made landslide. And yet, despite its importance, the story Moccasin Bluff tells is not straightforward. If anything, it's a tangle of cultures, artifacts, technologies, and unanswered questions. Because while we know what is there, we still don't fully understand why it changed the way it did. Let's unpack the site. At its base are late, archaic materials, stone tools, fire pits, food debris, typical of mobile foragers who returned seasonally. Then come the woodland occupations, early, middle, and late. Pottery appears, storage pits, post molds. Then, later, signs of more permanent structures, agricultural traces, burial activity, trade items, cultural mixing. It's that slow drift from foraging to farming, from seasonal use to year-round settlement, that makes Moccasin Bluff a critical case study. Because here, in a relatively small stretch of riverbank, you can watch change happen. Some of the most striking artifacts come from the middle woodland layer, when the Hopewell exchange networks were at their peak. Bits of mica, marine shell, and even obsidian have been found, materials not native to Michigan and not easily acquired. That means people at Moccasin Bluff were connected, tied into vast social systems that spanned rivers and ridges, forest and prairie. But as time passed, those networks dissolved. By the late woodland period, the signs of distant contact fade. Pottery becomes simpler, trade goods become rare. Villages grow smaller, more insular. Something shifted culturally, economically, ideologically. Whether due to internal social evolution, environmental change, or external pressures, we can't say for sure. What we do know is that the site persisted. People adapted. Agriculture took hold. Corn, beans, and squash began to supplement hunting and gathering. The layout of the village changed. More storage, more permanence, possibly larger social groups. And then, somewhere in the historical shadows, contact happened. European goods begin to appear in the uppermost layers: glass beads, iron tools, the smoking gun of colonial interaction, and with them come even more questions. Who were the first to arrive? How did these new materials affect indigenous life? Were they adopted eagerly, cautiously? Was this peaceful trade or a prelude to conflict? The archaeological record here doesn't answer those questions clearly. Instead, Moccasin Bluff offers ambiguity, evidence of continuity and rupture, of people holding on to old ways while experimenting with new ones, of cultural resilience that doesn't fit neatly into timelines or categories. It's the kind of site that frustrates tidy narratives, and that's exactly why it matters. Because Real history isn't clean. It's layered, messy, full of overlaps and contradictions, just like the bluff itself. And if Moccasin Bluff reveals the complexities of contact and continuity, the next puzzle lies not in what people built, but in what they dug. Deep into the earth, into raw stone. And what they left behind was not just villages or graves, but quarries and tools that traveled farther than anyone expected. Bayport chert quarries and far-flung tools. The true scale and roots of stone tool material circulation aren't fully mapped. Step away from the rivers for a moment and head northeast into the Saginaw lowlands. The landscape flattens, the soil darkens, and buried under layers of glacial till, another kind of history lies waiting. Not houses, not bones, stone. Welcome to the Bayport chert quarries. If copper was the metal of choice for ancient Michiganders, then chert, specifically Bayport chert, was their go-to stone. Sharp, durable, readily flakeable. A raw material that, when struck just right, could become an arrowhead, a knife, a scraper, a drill. And Bayport chert wasn't just used where it was quarried. It moved. Pieces of this creamy gray stone have been found scattered across Michigan, southern Ontario, and even into the Ohio River Valley. Traded, carried, left behind. A material map that stretches far beyond its source. But here's the rub. We still don't fully understand how far that network went, or how it operated. The quarries themselves are understated. No grand pits, no walls, just exposures areas where the chert was close enough to the surface to be extracted with stone hammers and antler picks. People came here to dig, to crack, to test and discard. Flakes litter the ground, broken cores, half-finished bifaces. Evidence not just of quarrying, but of workshops, places where stone was shaped on the spot before being hauled away. But when, and by whom? That's where things get fuzzy. Bayport chert use spans thousands of years. From the earliest archaic points to woodland-era tools, the styles change, the techniques evolve, but the source remains the same. People kept coming back, again and again, to this patch of land to dig out the past and shape their future. And yet, for all this evidence, the big picture remains blurred. What was the scale of production? Were there seasonal quarrying expeditions? Did groups come from far away? Or was access more local? Were there territorial controls, or was it open use? Did people trade raw chert or finished tools? The flakes don't answer. But the distribution of Bayport artifacts suggests a network, a wide one. That means people weren't just moving chert, they were moving ideas, technologies, designs. A style of blade could travel as fast as the stone itself, and sometimes faster. And here's where it gets strange. Because if you overlay chert distribution maps with known village and burial sites, certain corridors appear, not random paths, routes, arteries of interaction that hint at something deeper. Not just trade, but organization. Bayport wasn't just a quarry, it was a node, and that means prehistoric Michigan may have been far more interconnected than we assume. Not isolated bands scraping by, but networks of people sharing materials, skills, and symbols. But the ground doesn't give up its patterns easily. And for every tool found, there are hundreds still buried, forgotten, or worse, destroyed by farming, construction, or neglect. Still, each new find sharpens the picture. A blade here, a cache there, evidence not just of work but of movement. And movement, in prehistory, is everything. Because where people went and where they didn't tells us what they valued, what they feared, what they hoped to find, and sometimes what they lost. Which brings us to a different kind of absence. A silence so profound, it suggests that entire chapters of Michigan's prehistory are still hidden. Not because they were never there, but Because we're looking in the wrong place. Saginaw Bay region's missing sites. Paleo shorelines and buried floodplains likely hide whole chapters of prehistory. The Saginaw Bay region is massive, a yawning curve of shoreline thick with marshes, tangled rivers, and soft soils. Today, it's a mixture of farmland and wetland, bisected by highways and drainage ditches. But in the deep past, it was something else entirely. A paleo-wetland labyrinth, a place of enormous ecological richness. And if logic holds a place where people had to have been, so where are they? The mystery of the missing sites in Saginaw Bay isn't that we found too little. It's that we've found almost nothing from the earliest periods of human occupation. No Clovis kill sites, no big early archaic camps. Very few middens, sparse tools, scattered points. It's a silence that grows louder with every survey. But archaeologists don't think it's an absence of occupation. They think it's an absence of visibility. Because the Saginaw Basin is buried, not metaphorically, literally. Over the last 10,000 years, rivers shifted, floodplains expanded, sediment piled high over the old landscapes. Entire ancient shorelines were submerged by lake-level rise and deltaic buildup. Campsites were swallowed by mud, hearths buried under meters of organic muck. The land itself conspired to hide the past. Remote sensing and paleo-environmental reconstruction have revealed hints former high ground, now drowned by swamp, old river meanders that once skirted campsites. These paleo landscapes could hold entire missing records of prehistoric life, intact, untouched, and completely invisible from the surface. And this silence matters. Because if we don't find those sites, we risk misunderstanding the timeline, the patterns, the story of how early peoples moved, settled, and survived in one of Michigan's most ecologically rich zones. We risk missing the entire prologue. And yet, new tools, ground-penetrating radar, sediment coring, LiDAR, are starting to change the game. Because sometimes, the first step in uncovering history is realizing where we forgot to look. And next, we turn to those tools, to the remote sensing tech, now peeling back the layers of earth and water that keep Michigan's oldest secrets submerged. New remote sensing of eastern Michigan's drowned. Coastal landscapes models predict more sites than we found. If archaeology once depended on a trowel and a lucky break, today it increasingly relies on invisible tools, machines that see beneath the soil, algorithms that read the topography like a palimpsest. And in Michigan's case, especially in the east, along its sprawling lake margins, these technologies are starting to whisper about a forgotten world. Let's be blunt. Eastern Michigan's prehistoric site density does not match its potential. It should be rich. It should be a treasure map of shoreline activity, trade, and habitation. And yet, much of it still reads like a blank slate. The issue isn't whether people were there, it's whether we've looked in the right way. And the answer is increasingly, no, not yet. Enter remote sensing. Using tools like LiDAR, light detection and ranging, magnetometry, ground-penetrating radar, GPR, and aerial photogrammetry, archaeologists are beginning to reconstruct ancient landscapes that no longer exist. What once looked like just more farmland or swampy lowland turns out, under scrutiny, to be something else entirely buried. Paleo shorelines, former river deltas, drowned ridges, and long-lost high grounds. These weren't just geological features. They were living spaces, campsites, trails, gathering points, nodes in the mesh of prehistoric movement. And in eastern Michigan, where rising lake levels and delta growth have altered the land dramatically, this remote view is critical. Because it turns out that much of the old landscape, the one people actually lived on, is now underwater, buried, or fragmented under layers of silt and modern land use. To understand where the ancient people were, you first have to understand where the land was. And this is where predictive modeling enters the picture. By combining remote sensing data with known site locations, soil maps, hydrology, and even plant cover. Researchers are now building predictive models, digital landscapes, that suggest where unrecorded sites are most likely to be hiding. These are not just guesses. They're probability maps based on real-world variables, cross-referenced with thousands of data points. And what these models are showing is startling. There should be hundreds, perhaps thousands, of undocumented sites along Michigan's drowned coastlines and buried lowlands, fishing camps, tool workshops, burial areas. Some might date back to the Archaic or even Paleoindian periods. Others might show evidence of early agriculture, copperworking, or ritual use. What they all have in common is that they're hidden tucked away beneath the waterline or beneath 6 feet of loam, which means our picture of eastern Michigan's prehistory is not just incomplete. It's radically distorted. We've been reading the edges of a manuscript whose core chapters were ripped out and buried. And these missing chapters matter, because the eastern coast of Michigan bordering Lake Huron and the Thumb would have been a prime corridor for movement, trade, and settlement. The Saginaw Bay's ancient shoreline systems, river mouths, and inlets offered fish, shelter, and connection. It would have been a magnet for seasonal use and long-term return, a homeland, a route, a memory map, and yet, we're just now realizing how much lies beneath. The irony is that this entire landscape, once so rich in life, was hidden not by catastrophe, but by gradual change, lake levels rising inch by inch, sediment accumulating season by season. The erasure was slow, gentle, almost kind, and in that gentleness, it preserved, because in waterlogged sediments and buried wetlands, organic materials can survive: wood, bone, charcoal, even pollen and plant remains. If we find the sites, we don't just get tools, we get diet, seasonality, economy, belief systems. But finding them requires stepping into the future, using satellites, using sonar, using digital archaeology to unearth analog lives. And when those lives are uncovered, we begin to see a different Michigan. Not a flat map of stone and time, but a living network of people moving across land and water, adapting as shorelines shifted beneath their feet. And just upstream, on a river far to the west, a different kind of adaptation took root: farming, pre-contact agriculture, deep in the Upper Peninsula. Something nobody expected, and yet it was there, hidden in the woods. 60 islands, Menominee River, intensive pre-contact agriculture in the UP. How communities sustained it in that climate is still being reconstructed. Farming in the Upper Peninsula? That sounds like a punchline, especially in a place where even modern corn stunts and wilts in the short growing season. But deep in the Menominee River corridor, winding through the heavy forest and fractured rock of Michigan's northwest, archaeologists uncovered something truly unexpected. Fields. Not just patches, not just gardens, systems. And with them, a window into one of the most climate-defying experiments in Michigan's prehistoric record: intensive, pre-contact agriculture in a place where agriculture shouldn't have worked. The site is known as the 60 Islands area, a sprawling zone along the Menominee River, marked by a complex mosaic of elevated ground, riverine access, and strategic visibility. It's the kind of place that whispers of habitation even before a shovel hits the dirt. But what made it special wasn't just location. It was activity. Charred seeds, hoe marks, storage pits, evidence of cleared land, patterns in pollen and soil chemistry that point unmistakably to deliberate cultivation. This wasn't a one-season experiment. It was long-term, repeated, managed. And what they were growing was classic Eastern agricultural complex fare: native squash, sunflowers, goosefoot, little barley, plants that don't need plowing or monoculture rows. Plants that thrive in marginal soils when nurtured with knowledge and patience. And the people here clearly had both. But how? How did they manage sustained agriculture in a region known for frost, rocky soils, and limited growing days. The answer lies in strategy. They didn't just plant anywhere. They chose microenvironments, south-facing slopes, river terraces with good drainage, areas shielded from wind and frost pockets. They likely used controlled burns to manage underbrush, clear land, and replenish soil nutrients. They built storage systems, not granaries in the modern sense, but pits and caches that allowed them to smooth out the seasonal highs and lows. And perhaps most critically, they wove agriculture into a broader subsistence web. Farming here wasn't about replacing hunting and gathering. It was about supplementing them. Balancing risk, increasing surplus, creating food security in an unpredictable world. The 60 Islands zone wasn't isolated either. Artifacts from the area suggest ties to broader networks, pottery styles that echo downriver, copper objects linked to northern sources, stone tools made from distant quarries. This wasn't a backwater. It was a node, a confluence of subsistence, ceremony, and exchange. And yet, we still don't know who exactly was farming here. Was this a band of early Anishinaabe ancestors? A woodland-era group pushing the limits of known lifeways? An offshoot of a southern tradition adapted to northern challenges? The evidence doesn't offer clean answers. What it does offer is a challenge to our assumptions. That farming required flat, southern land. That northern life was always about survival. That innovation only came from the center. The 60 Islands people remind us that boundary zones, ecologically, geographically, culturally, are often the most dynamic, the most experimental, the most human. And that sense of flexibility, of movement between lifeways, carries into our final mystery for this trio. Because just across the water on a different island altogether, people once mined, lived, and moved in rhythm with copper and stone. But how did the pieces fit? What connected their minds, their homes, their strategies? And why, after thousands of years, did they seem to drift into silence? Menong Mine plus Macargo Cove Settlement, the precise relationship between mining camps, villages, and mobility strategies remains under study. The Menong Ridge snakes through Isle Royale like a buried lightning bolt, jagged, ancient, and mineral-rich. It's no surprise that the area around Menong Mine is riddled with copper pits, hammerstones, and smelter remnants. What's surprising is how old some of those pits are, thousands of years old. Long before Europeans arrived, before modern mining, before cities or coins. This is prehistoric copper country, and Macargo Cove, just southeast of Menong Mine, holds the key to a question that continues to echo across the archaeological landscape. How did ancient miners live? Because they didn't just work, they settled, at least for a while. The cove itself is a protected bay, sheltered from wind, accessible by canoe, rich in fish and fresh water. It's the logical place for a base camp. And the archaeological remains agree. Middens, hearths, broken tools, ceramic fragments. But here's the kicker. The occupation layers at Macargo Cove don't line up cleanly with the most intense mining phases. There's overlap, yes, but also gaps. So were these miners, traders, families supporting laborers, seasonal visitors? Or was the cove a staging area, a logistical hub for a broader, mobile system? The answer remains elusive. What we do know is that people returned here, again and again. They left their waste, they cooked, they repaired tools. They may have processed copper nodules brought from inland pits, but the exact nature of their strategy, how often they moved, how long they stayed, whether the same groups did both mining and settlement, is still under study. What's clear is this: the rhythm of life on Isle Royale was never simple. It was tied to metal, to seasons, to memory, and perhaps, most of all, to mobility. Because, in prehistoric Michigan, movement wasn't a side note. It was the engine of survival.